They called her barren, cursed, worthless, so her own family sold her like livestock to a stranger on a frozen mountain. Grace Weller never imagined that the man who bought her for a pouch of coins would be the one to prove everyone wrong. In just 3 days, she'd discover the truth her family never wanted to believe. This is the story of a woman condemned by lies, a widower drowning in grief, and a love that defied an entire town's cruelty. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Grace's story travels. The winter of 1876 carved through Evergreen Hollow like a blade through bone. Snow fell in sheets so thick that the world beyond 10 feet disappeared into white oblivion, and the wind howled through the valley with a voice that sounded almost human, almost pleading. It was the kind of cold that didn't just freeze your skin, it froze hope itself, turning it brittle and breakable. Grace Weller had stopped feeling the cold hours ago. She trudged behind the wagon, her boots sinking into snow that rose past her ankles with each labored step. The rope around her wrists had rubbed the skin raw, and tiny spots of blood had frozen into dark crystals against the hemp fibers. Her breath came in ragged clouds, and her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves. Gloves that had belonged to her mother once, before her mother decided Grace wasn't worth keeping warm anymore. The wagon ahead creaked and groaned under its meager load. Her father, Samuel Weller, sat hunched on the driver's bench, his broad shoulders curved against the wind. He hadn't looked back at her once since they left town 3 hours ago. Not what once. Beside him sat her older brother, Thomas, who kept his eyes fixed firmly on the horizon, as if Grace had already ceased to exist. "Papa," Grace called out, her voice cracking from disuse and cold. "Papa, please." Samuel's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn. The reins snapped against the horse's flanks, and the wagon lurched forward a few more feet before the wheels caught in a drift. "Save your breath, girl," her brother muttered without looking at her. "You'll need it for the climb." Grace's chest tightened. The climb. They were taking her up to Carver's Ridge, the desolate stretch of mountainside where only the desperate or the mad chose to live. She'd heard stories about the man who lived up there, Luke Carver, the widower who'd lost his wife and infant son 2 winters past. Some said he'd gone feral with grief. Others whispered darker things, that he'd killed them himself, that their ghosts still wandered his property, that any woman foolish enough to step foot on his land would never leave alive. But Grace knew the real reason they were taking her there. It had nothing to do with ghosts or curses. It had everything to do with the word that had poisoned her life for the past 3 years. Infertile. 3 years ago, Grace had been engaged to Pastor Whitmore's son, a pale, nervous young man named Edmund who'd proposed with all the enthusiasm of someone accepting a jail sentence. The engagement had lasted 6 months before Edmund's mother, the formidable Agnes Whitmore, had summoned the town doctor to examine Grace. Dr. Winters had poked and prodded, asked invasive questions, and finally declared, based on nothing but superstition and prejudice, that Grace's body showed signs of barrenness. The word had spread through Evergreen Hollow like plague. Within a week, Edmund had broken their engagement. Within a month, Grace couldn't walk down Main Street without hearing whispers. Within a year, even the farmhands who'd once smiled at her refused to meet her eyes. Barren, cursed, empty. Her mother had wept at first, raging at the unfairness of it all. But as the months passed and Grace's prospects dwindled to nothing, those tears had dried into something harder. Resentment, shame. And finally, the cold calculation that led to this moment, selling their daughter to a man who didn't care whether she could bear children because he'd already lost the only family he'd ever want. The wagon stopped. Grace nearly collided with it, so lost in her bitter thoughts that she hadn't noticed they'd reached the ridgeline. Her father climbed down from the bench with the stiffness of a man whose joints had frozen solid, and Thomas jumped down after him, stomping his feet to restore circulation. "We're here," Samuel said, and his voice sounded older than Grace remembered. Tired, hollowed out. Grace looked around, her heart sinking. They stood at the edge of a narrow clearing carved out of the wilderness. Ancient pines towered on 3 sides, their branches heavy with snow that muffled every sound. In the center of the clearing sat a cabin, if it could even be called that. It was little more than a rough structure of logs and stones, with a chimney that leaked thin gray smoke into the white sky. A lean-to stable stood off to one side, and behind it Grace could make out the dark shapes of fencing that stretched back into the trees. and standing in front of the cabin, as still as one of the surrounding pines, was a man. Luke Carver didn't look like the monster from the town's whispered stories. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of solid, muscular build that came from years of hard physical labor. His hair was dark, almost black, and long enough to brush his collar. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but even from a distance, Grace could see his eyes, pale gray, like winter ice, and just as cold. He wore a heavy coat that had seen better years, canvas pants tucked into worn boots, and leather gloves that looked as though they'd been patched multiple times. A rifle rested in the crook of his arm, not aimed at them, but present. A reminder. Samuel cleared his throat and took a few steps forward, his hand rising in an awkward wave. "Mr. Carver, we spoke 2 weeks back about the, arrangement." Luke said nothing. He simply stood there, watching them with those pale, unreadable eyes. Grace's father shifted his weight, clearly unnerved by the silence. "This is Grace, my daughter. She's a hard worker, good cook, knows her way around a farm. She won't give you any trouble." Grace felt her throat close. Her father was describing her like livestock at auction. Good bloodlines, strong teeth, guaranteed not to complain. "She's healthy," Thomas added, stepping up beside their father. "Never been sick a day in her life. And she's—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "She's clean. Unspoiled, if you understand my meaning." Grace wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but the rope around her wrists and the miles of frozen wilderness at her back kept her rooted in place, a prisoner of circumstances she'd never chosen and couldn't escape. Luke Carver finally moved. He descended the 3 rough steps from his cabin door and crossed the clearing with long, measured strides. Up close, he was even more imposing, not threatening exactly, but solid, immovable, like one of the mountains themselves had taken human form and learned to walk. He stopped a few feet from Samuel and reached into his coat. For a heart-stopping moment, Grace thought he was going for a weapon, but instead he pulled out a small leather pouch. It jingled softly as he held it out. $50, Luke said. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, like gravel shifting beneath wagon wheels. As agreed. Samuel took the pouch with shaking hands, untied it, and counted the coins inside. Gold glinted dully in the gray light. Grace watched her father's face, saw the relief, the shame, the desperate gratitude all flickering across his weathered features, and something inside her broke so completely she wondered if she'd ever feel whole again. "That's all I'm worth?" The words escaped before she could stop them, her voice barely above a whisper. $50. No one answered. Samuel couldn't meet her eyes. Thomas turned away, suddenly fascinated by the tree line, and Luke Carver simply watched her with that same unreadable expression, as if she were a puzzle he hadn't quite decided whether to solve. Her father pocketed the coins and took a step backward. "She's all yours, then. The arrangement is—" "I know the arrangement," Luke interrupted. His tone wasn't harsh, just final. Conversation over. Samuel nodded rapidly, relieved to be dismissed. He climbed back onto the wagon with unseemly haste, and Thomas followed. Neither of them looked at Grace as Thomas took up the reins. "Papa," Grace said again, and this time her voice cracked completely. "Papa, please, don't do this. Don't leave me here. I'll work harder. I'll prove them wrong about—" "Enough!" Her father's voice cut through her pleading like an axe through kindling. He still wouldn't look at her. "You're a burden we can't afford anymore, Grace. This is better for everyone. You'll have a roof, food, more than you'd get begging on the streets once we're gone." "But I'm your daughter. You're not bearing anyone's children." The words exploded from him, raw and awful. "You're not giving us grandchildren, not bringing another family's support, not doing anything but eating our food and taking up space. At least this way you're useful to someone." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath at the cruelty of what had just been said. Grace felt the words land like physical blows, each one finding a vulnerable place in her heart and tearing it open. Thomas snapped the reins and the wagon lurched into motion. It turned in a wide arc, the horse straining against the snow, and began the long trek back down the mountain. Grace stood frozen, watching them go, her bound wrists hanging uselessly at her waist, and her breath coming in short, painful gasps. They didn't look back. Not once. When the wagon finally disappeared into the white curtain of falling snow, Grace felt her knees start to buckle. But before she could collapse, a hand caught her elbow, firm but not bruising. She looked up, startled, to find Luke Carver standing beside her. "Don't," he said quietly. "Not yet." She didn't understand what he meant until she felt the tears on her cheeks, already freezing in the bitter cold. She hadn't even realized she was crying. Luke released her elbow and pulled a knife from his belt. Grace flinched instinctively, but he simply reached for her bound wrists and sliced through the rope with one clean motion. The hemp fell away, and Grace gasped as blood rushed back into her hands, bringing with it 1,000 needle pricks of pain. "You can walk on your own," Luke said, returning the knife to its sheath. His voice wasn't cruel, not like her father's had been, just tired. So deeply, profoundly tired that Grace recognized it immediately because she'd been carrying that same exhaustion for years. He turned and started back toward the cabin. Grace stood there for a long moment, rubbing feeling back into her raw wrists. She could run, she supposed, make a break for the tree line and take her chances with the wilderness. But she had no coat thick enough for these mountains, no supplies, no knowledge of how to survive alone. She'd freeze to death before nightfall, and part of her whispered that maybe that wouldn't be so terrible. At least it would be her choice. But another part of her, a part that had somehow survived 3 years of shame and cruelty and rejection, refused to give up that easily. "I didn't ask for any of this," Grace thought fiercely, "but I'm not dying in the snow like a wounded animal just because my own family thinks I'm worthless." She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and followed Luke Carver toward his cabin. The interior was about what Grace had expected: rough, sparse, functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a decent fire burning in the hearth. A simple wooden table stood near the center of the room, flanked by 2 chairs that didn't match. Shelves lined the walls, holding basic supplies: canned goods, tools, a few battered books. A ladder led up to a loft where Grace could see the corner of a quilt-covered mattress. It was clean, she noted with some surprise. No dirt tracked across the floor, no dishes piled in the basin, no cobwebs strung across the corners. Whatever else Luke Carver might be, he wasn't living in squalor. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and hung it on a peg by the door, then gestured vaguely at the room. "There's food in the pantry, water in the barrel. Fire needs tending every few hours. I'll be outside most days, seeing to the cattle and horses." Grace slowly unwound her own thin shawl, uncertain where to put it. Luke noticed and pointed to another peg. She hung it there, her hands still trembling from cold and shock. "I didn't agree to this," she said quietly, not looking at him. "They made the deal without asking me, without even telling me until this morning." Luke was silent for a long moment. When Grace finally gathered the courage to glance at him, she found him studying her with those pale gray eyes, not leering or appraising, but simply looking, trying to see who she actually was beneath the shame and the fear. "I didn't ask them," he said finally. "I sent word to town that I needed help with the ranch, someone to manage the house while I handled the stock. Your father came to me with an offer I wasn't expecting. To buy his daughter? To give you somewhere to go when they couldn't stand keeping you anymore." The bluntness of it stole Grace's breath, but there was no cruelty in his tone, just a flat, honest assessment of reality. And somehow, that was worse than if he'd been mocking her. "Why?" Grace asked. "Why agree to it? You could have hired anyone. Why take on someone else's shame?" Luke turned away and began removing his gloves, finger by finger. "Because I know what it's like to be the person nobody wants around, the one whose grief makes everyone uncomfortable. The man who's supposed to move on, forget, find someone new. As if love and loss could be traded in like worn-out boots." He dropped the gloves on the table and finally met her eyes again. "I saw someone who needed a way out," he said simply, "and I have a way. That's all." Grace stood there, trying to process this strange, quiet man who'd bought her like property but spoke of giving her a way out, who lived alone on a mountain but kept his home clean and warm, who'd lost everything but still had enough compassion left to recognize pain in someone else. "What do you expect from me?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. "What are the terms of this arrangement?" Luke frowned slightly as if the question confused him. "I expect you to help run this place. Cook, clean, mend what needs mending. In exchange, you get food, shelter, and no one asking questions or passing judgment. That's all. That's all? Grace repeated. She'd heard stories about what men expected from women in these situations, about how housekeeper was often code for something much darker. That's all, Luke confirmed. Then he paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. I'm not... He stopped, rubbed a hand over his bearded face, and started again. I'm not looking for that. I'm not going to force anything on you that you don't freely give. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. You keep the house, I keep the ranch, we survive the winter. That's the deal. Grace searched his face for lies and found none, just exhaustion and a bone-deep loneliness that matched her own. All right, she said finally. Then I'll earn my keep. Something that might have been relief flickered across Luke's features. Good. There's stew in the pot if you're hungry. I need to check the fences before dark. He pulled his coat back on and headed for the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. Grace, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name. I know this isn't what you wanted, but you're not a prisoner here. Come spring, if you want to leave, I'll take you down to the valley, find you passage to wherever you want to go. You have my word. Before Grace could respond, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. She stood alone in the cabin, listening to his footsteps crunch through the snow, fading into the distance. Slowly, Grace sank into one of the mismatched chairs. Her wrists still ached where the rope had cut into them. Her feet were soaked through, her dress damp and clinging. She should tend to the fire, find dry clothes, eat something. But for a long moment, she simply sat there, trying to understand what had just happened to her life. 24 hours ago, she'd been in her parents' house, unwanted, certainly, but at least familiar. Now she was on a mountain, in the home of a stranger, with no clear future and no way back to the past. She'd been sold like a piece of furniture, discarded like trash, and told she was worth exactly $50 in gold. But Luke Carver had cut her bindings, had told her she could leave come spring, had looked at her not with disgust or pity, but with the weary recognition of one wounded soul seeing another. Maybe, Grace thought, that's worth more than $50 after all. She rose on unsteady legs and went to check the pot of stew. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was both strange and oddly comforting. Grace woke before dawn, stoked the fire, and prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush or fried eggs. Luke would appear from the loft, where he slept while Grace took the narrow bed tucked behind a curtain in the corner of the main room, eat in silence, and disappear outside to tend his stock. The ranch, Grace discovered, was larger than she'd initially realized. Luke kept a small herd of cattle in a sheltered valley beyond the tree line, along with several horses and a handful of chickens that somehow survived the brutal winters. He'd built an impressive system of shelters and fencing, all of it maintained with the meticulous care of a man who had nothing else to pour his energy into. Grace kept to her side of the bargain. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes and blankets, and did her best to make the rough cabin feel like something approaching a home. She discovered that Luke had a small library, books on animal husbandry, a few novels, and surprisingly, a volume of poetry so worn that the spine had cracked and several pages had come loose. She carefully repaired it one afternoon, stitching the binding back together with thread she found in a sewing box. That evening, when Luke came in from his work, he stopped short at the sight of the book lying on the table. "You fixed it," he said, picking it up carefully. "I hope that's all right," Grace replied, suddenly nervous. "I know I shouldn't have touched your things without asking, but I saw it was damaged, and I thought it was my wife's," Luke interrupted quietly. "Anna. She loved poetry, used to read to me in the evenings." Grace's throat tightened. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "No reason you should." Luke ran his fingers over the repaired spine. "Thank you for fixing it. I've been meaning to do it myself for 2 years, but He trailed off, and Grace understood. Sometimes the pain of touching something beloved was too much to bear. "I can read it to you," she offered impulsively. "If you'd like." The way she used to. Luke looked up sharply, and for a moment Grace thought she'd overstepped terribly, but then his expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. "I'd like that," he said, "if it's not too much trouble." So that night, After dinner had been cleared away, Grace opened the book of poetry and began to read by the firelight. Her voice was soft and slightly hesitant at first, but as she lost herself in the words, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shakespeare, it grew stronger. Luke sat in his chair, eyes closed, and listened. When she finally stopped, the fire had burned low and the night had grown deep around them. Anna had a better voice for it, Luke said, opening his eyes. But that was... He paused, searching for words. That was good. Thank you. It became their evening ritual. After the work was done and darkness had fallen, Grace would read while Luke listened. They didn't talk much otherwise. Luke wasn't a talkative man by nature, and Grace had learned over the years that silence was often safer than speech. But the poetry seemed to create a space where they could both exist without the weight of expectation or judgment. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, a blizzard rolled in. Grace had seen storms before. Living in Evergreen Hollow meant learning to respect winter's fury, but nothing had prepared her for the violence of a mountain blizzard. The wind screamed like something alive and angry, battering the cabin's walls with enough force to make the timbers creak. Snow drove sideways, so thick that Grace couldn't see the tree line only 30 yards away. We'll be snowed in for at least 3 days, Luke said, checking their supplies. Maybe longer. Do you have enough food? Grace asked. For the cattle? I'll need to get to the valley shelter. They've got hay stored there, but someone has to break ice on the water trough twice a day, or they'll die of thirst. Grace looked at him incredulously. You can't go out in this. You'll freeze to death before you get halfway there. They'll die if I don't. Then I'll come with you. 2 people can work faster than one, and... No. Luke's voice was flat and final. You're not risking your life for a few head of cattle. They're not just cattle, Grace shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. They're your livelihood, your life's work, and I'm not sitting here warm and safe while you die trying to save them alone. They stared at each other, locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Luke shook his head. You're as stubborn as Anna was, he muttered, but there was something almost like respect in his tone. Fine, but you do exactly what I say, when I say it. Understood? Understood. They bundled up in every piece of warm clothing they could layer on, tied a rope between themselves so they wouldn't get separated in the whiteout, and stepped out into the howling chaos. The cold was brutal, a living thing that clawed at exposed skin and drove icy needles into Grace's lungs with every breath. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her off her feet, and within seconds she couldn't tell which direction they'd come from. But Luke moved forward with grim determination, and Grace followed, trusting the rope between them to keep her from becoming lost forever in the white. It took them nearly an hour to reach the valley shelter when it should have been a 20-minute walk. By the time they stumbled into the relative protection of the 3-sided structure, Grace's fingers and toes had gone numb, and ice had formed in her eyelashes. But the cattle were there, huddled together for warmth, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Luke immediately began breaking ice on the trough, while Grace forked hay into the feeders. They worked in tandem, communicating more through gesture than words, their bodies moving with the efficiency of long practice, even though they'd only known each other a few weeks. When the work was done, Luke insisted they rest for a few minutes before attempting the journey back. They huddled together against the back wall of the shelter, sharing the meager warmth of their combined body heat while the storm raged beyond. Thank you, Luke said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. For coming, for helping. Grace managed a frost-cracked smile. That's the arrangement, isn't it? I keep house, you keep the ranch. We survive the winter. It's more than that now. Luke looked at her, his pale eyes searching. You know that, don't you? Grace's heart did something complicated in her chest. What do you mean? But Luke shook his head as if he'd revealed more than he'd intended. Come on, we need to get back before we freeze solid. The return journey was even worse than the first. The storm had intensified, and visibility had dropped to nothing. Twice, Luke had to physically pull Grace up when she fell. Once, the rope between them tangled on a buried branch, and they spent precious minutes freeing it with fingers so cold they could barely bend. When they finally stumbled back into the cabin, they were both shaking uncontrollably. Luke immediately built up the fire while Grace struggled out of her ice-crusted outer layers with numb, clumsy hands. Boots off, Luke ordered, his own teeth chattering. We need to check for frostbite. They sat on the floor in front of the fire, examining each other's extremities. Grace's toes had turned an alarming gray-white, and Luke's left hand showed similar discoloration. They took turns rubbing circulation back into the affected areas, a painful process that brought tears to Grace's eyes. "I'm sorry," Luke kept saying as he worked on her feet, his touch gentle despite the necessary roughness. "I shouldn't have let you come. If you'd lost your toes, or worse—" "Stop," Grace interrupted, reaching down to still his hands. "I chose to come, and we saved your herd. That's what matters." "No." Luke looked up at her, and the raw emotion in his face made Grace catch her breath. "You matter. You—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with himself, then forged ahead. "I thought I was dead inside. After Anna and the baby died, I felt nothing, just empty. Going through the motions of living because I didn't know what else to do. But you—" He broke off again, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was about to say. "You make me feel things again," he finished quietly. "And it terrifies me." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding. "Luke, I know this isn't what you signed up for," he continued in a rush, as if he needed to get all the words out before he lost his courage. "I know you were brought here against your will, that you probably hate me for being part of that you're only staying because you have nowhere else to go. But I need you to know you're not just a housekeeper to me anymore. He swallowed hard. "You're important." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, in this small circle of warmth and honesty, something profound was shifting. "I don't hate you," Grace said softly. "I've never hated you, and She paused, searching for her own courage. "I feel it too, this thing between us. I don't know what to call it, and maybe I shouldn't feel it at all considering how we came to be here, but it's real," Luke said fiercely. "Whatever it is, it's real." They sat there for a long moment, neither moving, both afraid that acknowledging what was happening between them might somehow break the spell. Then, slowly, carefully, Luke reached up and cupped Grace's face with one still cold hand. "I don't know how to do this again," he whispered. "I don't know if I remember how to let someone in, but I want to try. If you'll let me." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes falling closed. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," she admitted. "Everyone I've ever trusted has hurt me. But with you, I feel like maybe I could learn. Then we'll learn together." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that. Not kissing, not speaking, just existing in the same space, breathing the same air, allowing themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could be something more than two broken people surviving in the wilderness. The storm lasted 5 days. During that time, Grace and Luke made the dangerous journey to the cattle shelter twice more. They cooked together, read together, and gradually began talking, really talking, about the lives they'd lived before fate brought them to this mountain. Luke told her about Anna, about their courtship and marriage, about the joy when they'd learned a baby was coming, and the devastation when complications during childbirth took both mother and child in a single, horrible night. "I blame myself," he said quietly one evening as they sat by the fire. "The doctor said it wasn't anyone's fault, that these things just happen, but I kept thinking, if I'd gotten him there sooner, if I'd had more money for better care, if I'd done 1,000 different things differently." "It wasn't your fault," Grace said firmly, taking his hand. "Sometimes terrible things happen, and there's no reason for them. No one to blame, just loss." Luke squeezed her fingers. "Tell me about your loss." So Grace told him about the diagnosis of barrenness, about watching her engagement crumble and her reputation disintegrate, about the slow, crushing weight of being deemed worthless by everyone she'd ever known. "I felt like I'd failed at the one thing women are supposed to do," she whispered, "like my body had betrayed me, and everyone could see it. Everyone knew I was broken." "You're not broken," Luke said with quiet intensity. "That doctor was a fool and a charlatan. There's nothing wrong with you, Grace, nothing." "How can you know that?" "Because I've been living with you for a month, and I see a woman who's strong, capable, kind, and more resilient than anyone I've ever met. A woman who risks her life in a blizzard to save cattle that aren't even hers. A woman who can repair books and cook a decent stew and read poetry, like it's music." He paused. A woman worth a hell of a lot more than $50. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. You really believe that? I know it. The blizzard finally broke on the 6th day, and the world outside transformed into a winter wonderland, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Luke spent long hours digging them out, clearing paths to the woodpile, the well, and the barn. Grace worked beside him when she could, but mostly she focused on maintaining the cabin's warmth and ensuring they had food enough to restore their depleted energy. As January turned to February, something unspoken but unmistakable bloomed between them. Luke started lingering at breakfast, reluctant to head out to his work. Grace found herself humming as she went about her chores, a sound the cabin hadn't heard in years. They began sitting closer together during the evening readings, until one night Luke simply put his arm around her shoulders and Grace leaned into his warmth without a word being spoken. They were healing each other, Grace realized. Two people so wounded they'd stopped believing in anything beyond survival, slowly discovering that maybe there was more to life than just enduring. But Grace couldn't quite shake the shadow of her past. The word barren still echoed in her mind, a curse she couldn't escape. What would Luke think when he realized she could never give him children? Would he start to resent her the way Edmund had? Would he look at her one day with the same disgust her father had shown? One night, unable to sleep, Grace slipped out of bed and went to stand by the window. The moon was full, painting the snow-covered world in shades of silver and blue. It was beautiful, and so lonely it made her chest ache. Can't sleep? Luke's voice came from behind her, soft so as not to startle. Grace shook her head. Too many thoughts. Want to share them? She hesitated, then decided he deserved the truth. All of it. When we first met, you said this was just a business arrangement, she began slowly. That come spring, I could leave if I wanted, but things have changed between us. I think you feel it too. I do, Luke confirmed, moving to stand beside her. Grace, Let me finish, she interrupted gently. Please, because I need you to understand something before this goes any further. She took a deep breath. I can't have children, Luke. At least that's what everyone believes. And if this becomes more than it is now, I need you to know that, to understand what you'd be giving up. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then, do you believe it? The question caught her off guard. What? Do you believe you're barren? Or do you believe what a small-town quack told you based on nothing but superstition and prejudice? Grace blinked. I don't know. Maybe? Dr. Winters seems certain. Dr. Winters is an idiot who probably couldn't diagnose a cold if the patient was coughing in his face, Luke said bluntly. Anna and I tried for 3 years before we finally conceived. By your town's logic, one or both of us would have been declared barren. But we weren't. We just needed time. But what if they're right? Grace pressed, needing him to understand. What if I really can't? Then we don't have children, Luke said simply. Grace, I'm not with you because I want heirs or because I need someone to carry on the family name. I'm with you because you make me want to wake up in the morning. Because your voice reading poetry sounds like home. Because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. I love you, he said, and the words fell into the moonlit space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread forever. I didn't mean to. Didn't plan it. But somewhere between your arrival and now, it happened. And I don't care what some ignorant doctor said about your body. I care about you, all of you. Grace felt something break open inside her chest, not painfully, but like spring ice finally cracking after a long winter. I love you too, she whispered, and realized it was true. Somewhere in the midst of shared silence and evening poetry and dangerous blizzard rescues, she'd fallen completely, utterly in love with Luke Carver. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, wrapping her arms around him and pressing her face against his chest. His heart beat steadily beneath her ear, strong and real and alive. So what do we do now? Grace asked. Luke pressed a kiss to the top of her head. We live, he said simply. We keep the house, tend the ranch, survive the winter, and we love each other. That's enough. That's everything. And standing there in the moonlight, wrapped in the arms of a man who saw her, truly saw her, broken places and all, and loved her anyway. Grace finally believed it might be true. The confession changed everything and nothing all at once. Grace woke the next morning to find Luke already up, stoking the fire with practiced efficiency. When he heard her stirring, he turned and smiled, a real smile, not the cautious half-expressions he'd been giving her for weeks. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines that grief had carved there and making him look years younger. "Morning," he said, and the simple word carried a warmth that made Grace's heart flutter. "Morning," she replied, feeling suddenly shy. They'd declared their love last night, but what did that mean for the daily reality of their lives? Were they courting now? Were they something more? The rules that govern normal relationships didn't seem to apply to two people who'd been brought together through a $50 transaction. Luke seemed to sense her uncertainty. He crossed the room and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Nothing has to change unless you want it to," he said quietly. "We can take this as slow as you need. I'm not going anywhere." Relief flooded through Grace. "Slow sounds good," she admitted. That is, Edmund and I were engaged, but we never even—" She trailed off, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Understanding dawned in Luke's eyes. "I'm not Edmund," he said firmly, "and I'm not going to rush you into anything. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, you'll let me know. Until then, we're just us, two people learning how to be together." "Just us," Grace repeated, and found herself smiling. "I like that." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Grace's life. February melted into March, and though the snow remained thick on the ground, the days grew incrementally longer and the sun climbed a little higher in the pale sky. Luke taught Grace how to handle the horses, how to read weather patterns in the clouds, how to identify animal tracks in the snow. She taught him that meals could be more than just fuel. She experimented with seasonings from his sparse stores and managed to create dishes that made him close his eyes in appreciation. They talked constantly now, making up for all those weeks of silence. Luke told her about growing up on a ranch in Montana, about his parents who'd died when he was 20, about the years he'd spent drifting before finally settling here in these mountains. Grace shared stories of her childhood in Evergreen Hollow, carefully editing out the painful parts and focusing on the good memories. Summer festivals, winter sleigh rides, the one perfect Christmas before everything went wrong. "What would you have done?" Luke asked her one evening as they sat by the fire. "If the doctor hadn't declared you barren, if you'd married Edmund, what would your life have looked like?" Grace considered the question, surprised to find she had to really think about it. A few months ago, she could have answered immediately. She'd spent years mourning the life she'd lost. But now, "I don't know," she said slowly. "I thought I wanted what every woman was supposed to want: a husband, children, a respectable place in society. But I don't think I ever wanted Edmund specifically. I just wanted not to be alone." "And now?" Grace looked at him, really looked at him, at the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, at the strength in his hands as they held his coffee cup, at the vulnerability in his eyes that he only showed her. "Now I think maybe I was looking for the wrong things," she said softly. "Maybe having the life everyone expected wasn't as important as finding someone who actually saw me, someone who didn't look at me like I was broken." "You were never broken," Luke said, not for the first time, but now Grace was starting to believe it. They kissed for the first time on a morning in mid-March, when the wind had finally stopped its incessant howling and the world outside lay hushed beneath fresh snow. Grace had been reaching for her shawl, preparing to go collect eggs from the chicken coop, when Luke caught her hand and spun her gently around to face him. "I've been wanting to do this," he murmured, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Grace didn't want to pull away. She lifted her face to his, her heart hammering, and when his lips met hers, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, Luke's beard soft against her skin, his hand cradling the back of her head like she was something precious. When they finally pulled apart, Grace found herself breathless and smiling. "I've been wanting you to do that too," she admitted. From then on, affection became as natural as breathing. Luke would drop kisses on her temple as he passed behind her chair. Grace would rest her hand on his shoulder while he worked on mending a harness. They fell asleep in each other's arms more nights than not, Luke having abandoned the loft entirely to share Grace's bed, though they did nothing more than hold each other and talk in the darkness until sleep claimed them. "I want to marry you," Luke said one night, his voice rumbling through his chest where Grace's head rested. "Properly. Not this strange arrangement your father forced on us, but a real marriage. When the snow melts and the pass opens, we could go down to the valley. Find a preacher. Make it official." Grace's breath caught. "You want to marry me?" "More than I've wanted anything in a long time." Luke's arms tightened around her. "I know it's fast. I know we've only really been together a couple months, but when you've lost as much as I have, you learn not to waste time. Life's too short and too uncertain. I love you, Grace Weller. I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears pricked Grace's eyes, happy tears for once. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They sealed the promise with a kiss that started gentle and grew more heated, Luke's hands tangling in Grace's hair while she clutched at his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "We should stop," he said, though he made no move to let her go. "Why?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. "Because I want to do this right. I want to marry you first, make you my wife in truth before—" He broke off, clearing his throat roughly. Grace felt a surge of affection for this complicated man who could be so tender despite all his roughness, who wanted to honor her even though they already lived together and loved each other. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "But Luke, we're already living as husband and wife in every way that matters except one, and I don't want to wait anymore." Luke pulled back to look at her, his gray eyes searching. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Grace reached up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone. "I trust you. I love you. And I'm tired of letting other people's rules dictate what I can and can't do with my own life." Something flickered in Luke's expression. Desire, yes, but also a deeper emotion that made Grace's heart swell. "Then come here," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that sent shivers down her spine. What followed was tender and occasionally awkward, both of them fumbling through nerves and inexperience. But it was also beautiful in its honesty, two people choosing each other, despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. When it was over, Grace lay in Luke's arms, feeling more whole than she'd ever felt in her life. "I love you," she murmured against his chest. "I love you too," Luke replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "My Grace. My Grace." The possessiveness in those words should have scared her, should have made her bristle at being claimed. But instead, they made her feel safe, protected, like she finally belonged somewhere. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, warm and loved, and completely at peace. 3 days later, Grace woke up nauseated. At first, she dismissed it as something she'd eaten. Perhaps the venison from the previous night hadn't been as fresh as she'd thought. But when the nausea struck again the next morning and the morning after that, a different possibility began to whisper at the edges of her consciousness. No, it couldn't be. The doctor had said, but Dr. Winters was a fool, Grace reminded herself, echoing Luke's words. And it had been 3 weeks since that first night together. 3 weeks of falling asleep in Luke's arms and waking to his kisses, of learning each other's bodies and discovering that passion could be gentle and wild all at once. Grace pressed a trembling hand to her stomach. Could it be possible? Could her body, the body that everyone had declared broken and useless, actually be carrying a child? She didn't tell Luke, not yet. She needed to be sure, and she needed time to process what this might mean. If she was wrong, if this was just illness or her imagination playing tricks, she didn't want to give him false hope. And if she was right, Grace's mind spun with possibilities and fears. What if the pregnancy didn't take? What if something went wrong, the way it had with Anna? What if Grace's body really was broken, and this was just a cruel trick of fate? But as the days passed and her symptoms persisted, the nausea, the exhaustion, the strange tenderness in her breasts, doubt slowly transformed into cautious hope. And when she realized her monthly bleeding was over a week late, hope bloomed into something closer to certainty. She was pregnant. Against all odds, despite every dire prediction and medical pronouncement, Grace Weller was carrying a child. The realization struck her one morning as she stood at the window, watching Luke work with one of the horses in the paddock. Her hand drifted to her stomach, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the full weight of joy and terror that came with this knowledge. A baby. Luke's baby. Proof that she wasn't broken after all, that her body was capable of this most fundamental miracle, but also proof that Dr. Winters had been wrong, that her family had sold her based on a lie, that she'd spent 3 years believing herself worthless for no reason at all. The anger came then, swift and bitter. How dare they? How dare Dr. Winters pronounce judgment on her fertility based on nothing but his own prejudice? How dare her parents believe him without question, without even trying to get a second opinion? How dare Edmund look at her with disgust and pity, as if she were something less than human? They'd stolen 3 years of her life. 3 years of shame and isolation and crushing loneliness, all because of one man's incompetent diagnosis and an entire town's willingness to believe the worst of her. Grace felt tears streaming down her face, tears of rage and relief and overwhelming vindication. She'd been right. She'd been right all along to question the diagnosis, to resent the label they'd forced upon her, and now she had proof. "Grace?" Luke's voice came from behind her, concerned. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" She turned to face him, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I'm pregnant." Luke froze, his eyes going wide with shock. "What?" "I'm pregnant," Grace repeated, and now she was laughing through her tears. "I'm carrying your child, Luke, your child. The doctors were wrong. My family was wrong. Everyone was wrong. I'm not barren. I never was." For a long moment, Luke just stared at her, his face cycling through disbelief, wonder, and finally pure, unfiltered joy. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her clear off the ground and spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. "You're sure?" he asked, setting her down but keeping his hands on her waist as if afraid she might disappear. "You're absolutely sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. But Luke, my monthly bleeding hasn't come, and I've been sick every morning for a week, and She placed his hand on her stomach. "I can feel it. Something's different. Something's growing." Luke's hand trembled against her belly, his eyes filling with tears. "A baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Grace, we're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. She knew he'd lost his first child, knew the pain that loss had caused. What if this brought back too many painful memories? What if he was terrified rather than excited? But Luke's answer came without hesitation. "Happy." He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Grace, I don't even have words for what I'm feeling. Grateful. Amazed. Terrified. But yes. God, yes. I'm happy. You've given me back everything I thought I'd lost. You've given me a future worth living for." They held each other for a long time, both crying and laughing and trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. Finally, Luke pulled back, his expression turning serious. "We need to get you to a real doctor," he said. "Not that quack in Evergreen Hollow, but someone competent. Someone who can make sure you're healthy, that the baby's developing properly." "The nearest real doctor is in Silver Creek," Grace said. "That's a 3-day ride from here." "Then we'll go to Silver Creek. As soon as the pass clears, we're leaving." Grace started to protest. The journey would be hard, and she didn't want to risk the pregnancy. But Luke shook his head firmly. "I'm not taking any chances," he said. "Not with you, and not with our child. We're getting you proper medical care, even if I have to carry you down the mountain myself." Something in his tone made Grace understand. This wasn't negotiable. Luke had lost one wife and child to complications during birth. He wasn't going to risk losing another. "All right," she agreed softly. "We'll go to Silver Creek, but Luke, I also want to go back to Evergreen Hollow." His expression darkened. "Why would you want to go back there? Those people treated you like dirt." "Exactly." Grace lifted her chin, and Luke saw the steel in her eyes that had kept her alive through 3 years of shame and rejection. "I want them to see. I want them to know they were wrong. Every single person who whispered about me, who looked at me with pity or disgust, who believed I was cursed, I want them all to see that I'm pregnant, that I was never the problem." Luke studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You want to show them," he said. You want to prove them wrong. Don't I deserve that? Grace asked quietly. Don't I deserve to walk through that town with my head held high, carrying proof that they broke my life for no reason? You deserve that and more, Luke agreed. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. We'll go to Silver Creek first. Make sure everything's progressing well. Then, if the doctor gives his blessing, we'll go to Evergreen Hollow. And you can show every last one of them exactly how wrong they were. Grace felt something fierce and triumphant unfurl in her chest. For 3 years, she'd accepted the town's judgment without question, had internalized their shame and made it her own. But no more. She was done being the victim of other people's ignorance and cruelty. She was going to be a mother, and she was going to make damn sure everyone who'd ever doubted her knew it. The next few weeks passed in a strange mixture of joy and anxiety. Luke became almost comically protective, insisting that Grace rest more, work less, and avoid anything that might be even remotely strenuous. Grace tolerated his hovering with amused patience, understanding that it came from love and fear rather than any desire to control her. The snow began its slow retreat as March gave way to April. The days grew longer and warmer, and the first green shoots of spring began pushing through the softening earth. Luke checked the pass daily, watching for signs that it had cleared enough for safe travel. Grace's body continued to change in small but noticeable ways. Her breasts swelled and became tender. Her waist thickened slightly, though she wasn't showing yet. The morning nausea persisted but wasn't unbearable, and she found that dry bread and weak tea helped settle her stomach. One evening, as they lay together in bed, Luke's hand resting protectively on her stomach, Grace asked the question that had been haunting her since she'd confirmed the pregnancy. "What if something goes wrong?" she whispered into the darkness. "What if I lose the baby? What if something happens during the birth, like it did with Anna?" Luke was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her belly. "Then we'll face it together," he said finally. "Grace, I won't lie to you. I'm terrified. Every time I think about you going through labor, I remember finding Anna." His voice broke, and Grace felt him shudder. "But you're not Anna, and this isn't the same situation. We're going to get you the best medical care available. We're going to do everything right, and then we're going to trust that God or fate, or whatever force governs this universe, will be kind to us. And if it's not kind, then at least we'll have had this." Luke pressed a kiss to her temple. "These months together, this love, this hope. Even if the worst happens, Grace, you've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have again. I won't regret any of it." Grace rolled over to face him, cupping his bearded cheek in her palm. "I love you," she said fiercely, "and I'm going to do everything I can to bring this baby safely into the world. For you, and for me, and for every woman who's ever been told she was worthless because her body didn't cooperate with someone else's expectations." "I love you too," Luke replied, and sealed the promise with a kiss. Finally, in the 3rd week of April, Luke declared the pass safe enough for travel. They packed carefully: food, water, warm clothes in case the weather turned, and the small amount of money Luke had saved over the years. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness as she watched him saddle 2 of his gentlest horses. This was it. They were leaving the sanctuary of the cabin, the isolated bubble where their love had grown without interference or judgment. They were going back into the world, a world that had been cruel to both of them. What if things went wrong? What if the doctor in Silver Creek was no better than Dr. Winters? What if going back to Evergreen Hollow reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal? "Hey," Luke said softly, appearing at her side. "Where'd you go just now?" Grace managed a weak smile. "Just thinking, worrying." "About?" "Everything." She gestured helplessly. "What if this is a mistake? What if we should just stay here where we're safe?" Luke took her hands in his. "Grace, we can't hide forever. And more importantly, you shouldn't have to hide. You deserve to walk through that town with your head high. You deserve to show them they were wrong about you. Don't let fear steal that from you." He was right, Grace knew. She'd spent too much of her life afraid of rejection, afraid of shame, afraid of proving everyone's worst assumptions correct. But she wasn't that frightened girl anymore. She was a woman who'd survived being sold by her own family, who'd built a life in the wilderness, who'd found love in the most unlikely of places. She was stronger than she'd ever given herself credit for. "You're right," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Let's go show them who Grace Carver really is." Luke grinned. "Grace Carver," he repeated, testing out the sound of it. "I like that, though we should probably make it official before you start using it." "Is that a proposal?" "It's a reminder of the proposal I already made. One we'll make legal as soon as we find a preacher willing to marry us." They set out just after dawn, leaving the cabin locked and secure behind them. The journey down the mountain was slow and careful, Luke constantly checking on Grace to make sure she wasn't overtaxed. But despite his concerns, Grace felt strong and capable, her body adjusting to the gentle rhythm of horseback travel. The world beyond the mountain was waking up after its long winter sleep. Wildflowers dotted the meadows in splashes of yellow and purple. Streams ran high with snowmelt, their rushing water a constant music. Birds called from the trees, and once, Grace spotted a deer and her fawn watching them from a distance before bounding away. They made camp that first night in a sheltered hollow, and Luke insisted on doing all the work while Grace rested. She protested, but he was adamant. "You're carrying precious cargo," he said, building up the fire. "I'm not taking any chances." Grace rolled her eyes, but couldn't quite hide her smile. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass." "You're my world," Luke countered, "which means you get treated like it." They reached Silver Creek late on the afternoon of the third day. The town was larger than Evergreen Hollow, with actual paved streets and brick buildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Luke asked around and was directed to Dr. Harrison, a middle-aged physician with kind eyes and a reassuring manner. Grace's hand shook as they entered his office. What if he examined her and declared that something was wrong? What if the baby wasn't developing properly? What if he confirmed all her worst fears? But Dr. Harrison was thorough and gentle, asking questions about her symptoms and medical history, while Luke sat nearby, his hand gripping hers tightly. When Grace mentioned Dr. Winter's diagnosis of barrenness, Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Based on what evidence?" he asked. I don't know," Grace admitted. He never really explained, just said my body showed signs of it." Harrison shook his head in disgust. "Quackery," he muttered. "Pure quackery." "Miss Weller, Mrs. Carver," Luke interrupted firmly, though they hadn't actually married yet. "Or soon to be." "Mrs. Carver," Harrison corrected with a slight smile. "I can tell you with absolute certainty that you are, indeed, pregnant. Based on what you've told me about your last monthly bleeding and your symptoms, I'd estimate you're about 6 to 8 weeks along. Your body is responding exactly as it should, and I see no reason to believe you'll have any complications." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "You're sure? You're absolutely sure?" "As sure as I can be at this early stage. Of course, pregnancy always carries risks, and I'd like to see you again in a few months for another examination. But right now, everything looks perfectly healthy and normal. You, my dear, are going to be a mother." The words hit Grace like a physical force. She burst into tears, great heaving sobs of relief and vindication and overwhelming joy. Luke pulled her into his arms, and she felt his own tears dampening her hair as he held her. "Thank you," Luke said hoarsely to Dr. Harrison. "Thank you for telling us the truth." Harrison looked at them with sympathy and understanding. "Someone should have told her the truth years ago," he said quietly. "Whoever diagnosed her as barren did her a grave disservice. I'm sorry you had to carry that burden for so long, Mrs. Carver." They stayed in Silver Creek for 2 more days, resting and gathering supplies for the next leg of their journey. Luke used some of their precious savings to buy Grace a new dress, something pretty and feminine that made her feel beautiful instead of broken. He also purchased a simple gold band from the town jeweler. "For when we make it official," he said, slipping it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. On the 3rd morning, they set out for Evergreen Hollow. As they rode, Grace felt her anxiety building. She hadn't seen her family or the town in almost 5 months. What would they say when they saw her? Would they even believe she was pregnant, or would they accuse her of lying? Would her mother show any remorse for what she'd done, or would she stand by the decision to sell her daughter? "We don't have to do this," Luke said, sensing her tension. "We can turn around right now, go back to the mountain, and never look back." Grace considered it, truly considered it. It would be so easy to just disappear, to build their life in isolation and forget that Evergreen Hollow had ever existed. But that would mean letting them win. It would mean accepting that she was the one who should be ashamed when they were the ones who'd failed her so completely. "No," she said firmly. "I need to do this. I need them to see." They reached Evergreen Hollow just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The town looked exactly as Grace remembered, the white church steeple rising above the other buildings, the general store with its familiar painted sign, the row of neat houses where respectable families lived their respectable lives. Grace had spent 22 years in this town, and in the end, it had chewed her up and spit her out without a second thought. They rode down Main Street slowly, deliberately. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Grace saw Mrs. Henderson's jaw actually drop. She saw Thomas Parker, who'd once asked to court her before the diagnosis, go pale and turn away. She saw Agnes Whitmore's eyes narrow with calculation and malice. Luke reached over and squeezed Grace's hand. "Head high," he murmured. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." Grace lifted her chin and stared right back at the gawking townspeople. Let them look. Let them wonder. Let them realize what they'd thrown away. They reined in at the town square right in front of the general store where the most people would see them. A crowd was already gathering, drawn by the spectacle of Grace Carver, returning from the dead, so to speak. Grace's mother pushed through the crowd, her face twisted with anger and confusion. "Grace," she said uncertainly, "what are you doing here? Who said you could come back?" "I don't need anyone's permission," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I came to show you something, Mother. Something you need to see." She dismounted carefully, Luke immediately at her side to steady her. Then, with deliberate slowness, she placed both hands on her still flat stomach and smiled. "I'm pregnant," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. 2 months along. Dr. Harrison in Silver Creek confirmed it just 3 days ago. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Grace's mother went white as snow. "That's impossible," she breathed. "Dr. Winters said—" "Dr. Winters was wrong," Grace interrupted, her voice ringing with conviction. "He was wrong, and you believed him without question. You sold me, your own daughter, because one incompetent doctor made a diagnosis based on nothing but prejudice and ignorance. And now here I stand carrying proof that I was never broken at all, that you threw me away for no reason." The silence that followed Grace's declaration was deafening, every eye in the square fixed on her stomach, as if they could see through the fabric of her dress to the life growing inside. Grace felt Luke's presence like a wall of strength behind her, his hand resting protectively on her lower back. Her mother's face cycled through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock, disbelief, shame, and finally, a desperate attempt at denial. "You're lying," she said, but her voice wavered. "You're making this up to embarrass us, to—" "Why would I lie?" Grace cut her off, her voice calm but edged with steel. "What would I possibly gain from it? I'm stating a simple fact, Mother. I'm pregnant. My husband and I are expecting a child in November." "Husband?" Her mother's eyes darted to Luke, taking in his rough appearance, his protective stance. "You married this stranger?" "This man saved me," Grace corrected. "When my own family sold me like livestock, he gave me a home, a life. And yes, love, something I never found in this town despite living here for 22 years. Agnes Whitmore pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her thin face pinched with suspicion. "Dr. Winters was very clear about your condition," she said loudly, addressing the crowd as much as Grace. "He examined you thoroughly. Are you suggesting that our town physician, a man with decades of experience, was somehow mistaken?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Grace replied, meeting the older woman's hostile gaze without flinching. "I'm stating a fact. Dr. Winters was wrong. And if you doubt me, I invite you to write to Dr. Harrison in Silver Creek. He'll confirm everything I've said." "Or perhaps this Dr. Harrison is simply telling you what you want to hear," Agnes shot back. "Perhaps you've convinced yourself of something that isn't true because you can't accept your own inadequacy." Luke's hand tightened on Grace's back, and she felt the tension radiating from him. Before he could speak, though, Grace held up a hand to stop him. This was her fight. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, and something in her tone made the crowd lean in to hear. "I've spent 3 years listening to people like you tell me what I am, what I'm capable of, what my body can and cannot do. 3 years of being treated like I was cursed, broken, worthless. And I believed you, all of you. I internalized your shame and made it my own." She took a step forward and Agnes actually stepped back. "But I'm done believing your lies," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm done accepting your judgment. Dr. Harrison is a respected physician in a town 3 times the size of this one. He examined me thoroughly and confirmed what I already knew in my heart. I'm carrying a healthy child. And if you choose not to believe that, Mrs. Whitmore, that says far more about you than it does about me." A murmur ran through the crowd. Grace saw some faces still twisted with doubt, but others, particularly some of the younger women, were looking at her with something that might have been admiration or hope. Thomas appeared then, pushing through the onlookers with their father shuffling behind him. Samuel Weller looked older than Grace remembered, his shoulders hunched and his face haggard. When he saw her, something painful flickered in his eyes. "Grace," he said hoarsely. "Girl, Don't call me that," Grace interrupted, her voice hard. "Don't call me girl, like I'm still your daughter, like you have any right to familiarity. You sold me, Father. You took money from me and left me with a stranger on a mountain. You told me I was a burden you couldn't afford anymore." Samuel flinched as if she'd struck him. "We thought we were doing what was best. You thought it would be easier to get rid of me than to question whether the doctor might be wrong," Grace finished. "You chose to believe I was worthless rather than fight for me. And now you want what? Forgiveness? Reconciliation?" "You're my daughter," Samuel said weakly. "You'll always be my daughter." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of these people. A father protects his daughter," she said quietly. "He believes in her. He fights for her. You did none of those things. So no, Mr. Weller, I'm not your daughter anymore. I'm Luke Carver's wife, and that's the only family I need." She turned away from him, away from the whole crowd, and found Luke watching her with fierce pride in his pale eyes. He offered her his hand, and she took it gratefully. "We should go," she murmured. "I've said what I came to say." But before they could mount their horses, a young woman broke from the crowd and ran toward them. Grace recognized her, Sarah Miller, who'd been 2 years behind Grace in school. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "Miss Grace," she said breathlessly. "I mean, Mrs. Carver, please, I have to know, is it true? Are you really—" "I'm really pregnant," Grace confirmed gently, seeing the raw hope in Sarah's face. "Why?" Sarah's hands twisted in her skirt. "Because Dr. Winters examined me last year, after I'd been married to Jacob for 18 months without conceiving. He said the same thing he said about you, that I was barren, that I'd never have children. And Jacob's mother keeps saying I'm cursed, that Jacob should set me aside and find a wife who can give him heirs, and I—" Her voice broke, and Grace's heart cracked open. This girl was living the same nightmare Grace had survived. She was being told she was worthless, broken, inadequate, all because of one man's incompetent diagnosis. "Sarah," Grace said firmly, taking the younger woman's hands, "listen to me. Dr. Winters is wrong. He was wrong about me, and I'd wager everything I have that he's wrong about you too. There's nothing wrong with your body. Some women just take longer to conceive than others. My husband's first wife tried for 3 years before she became pregnant. 3 years, Sarah. If Dr. Winters had examined her after 18 months, he probably would have declared her barren too." "But what if he's right?" Sarah whispered. "What if I really can't—" "Then you find a good doctor, a real doctor, not a small-town quack with outdated ideas, and you get a proper examination. And even if it turns out you can't have children, that doesn't make you worthless. Your value as a woman, as a person, has nothing to do with your ability to bear children. Do you understand me?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she choked out. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for showing us it's possible." Other women were edging closer now, Grace noticed. Women with haunted eyes and hunched shoulders. Women who'd been told they were failures, who'd been living under the same shadow of shame that had nearly destroyed Grace. They looked at her belly like it was a beacon of hope in their darkness. Grace realized then that her confrontation with the town hadn't just been about her own vindication. It was about giving voice to all the women who'd been silenced, who'd been told their worth was tied to their fertility, who'd internalized society's cruelty and made it their truth. "Listen to me," Grace said loudly, addressing all of them. "All of you. Don't let anyone, not doctors, not your families, not even your husbands, tell you what you're worth. Don't accept their labels or their limitations. Your bodies are your own. Your lives are your own. And you deserve better than to be judged by such a narrow, cruel standard." Agnes Whitmore made a sound of disgust. "This is exactly the kind of dangerous thinking that ruins young women," she announced. "Filling their heads with ideas above their station, making them question their betters." "Their betters?" Grace rounded on her, all the anger she'd been holding back finally breaking free. "You mean men like Dr. Winters, who make diagnoses based on superstition? Men like your son, who broke our engagement because he was too weak to stand up to you? People like you who take pleasure in other women's suffering because it makes you feel superior?" Agnes's face turned purple. "How dare you?" "I dare because I have nothing left to lose," Grace shot back. "You already took everything from me, my reputation, my future, my family. But I built a new life anyway. I found love anyway. And now I'm going to have a child anyway. So your opinion, Mrs. Whitmore, means absolutely nothing to me." The crowd was utterly silent now, watching this confrontation with wide eyes. No one in Evergreen Hollow ever spoke to Agnes Whitmore like this. The woman was practically royalty in this small town, her husband being the pastor and her family one of the oldest and most respected. But Grace was done being afraid. Agnes drew herself up to her full height, which was still several inches shorter than Grace. "You'll regret this insolence," she said coldly. "Mark my words, Grace Weller, you'll come crawling back here begging for forgiveness when that mountain man tires of you, when that baby, if there even is a baby, comes into the world and you realize you can't manage alone." "I won't be alone," Grace said quietly. "I have Luke, and that's more than enough." She turned back to her horse, done with this conversation, done with this town. But then a voice called out from the crowd, a voice she'd never expected to hear defending her. "She's telling the truth." Everyone turned to stare as Edmund Whitmore stepped forward, his pale face flushed and his hands trembling. His mother looked at him in shock. "Edmund, what are you—" "She's telling the truth, Mother," Edmund repeated, louder this time. His eyes met Grace's, and she saw guilt and shame written plainly there. "I've known for years that Dr. Winters was wrong about Grace. I heard him talking to Father once, after he examined her. He admitted he had no real basis for his diagnosis. He just said it because—" Edmund's voice dropped. "Because you told him to." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Agnes went white as death. "That's a lie," she hissed. "Edmund, you're confused. "I'm not confused," Edmund said. And for the first time since Grace had known him, there was steel in his voice. "You told Dr. Winters that the Weller family wasn't good enough for us, that Grace wasn't good enough for me. You said you needed a reason to break the engagement that wouldn't make our family look bad. So he gave you one. He declared her barren based on nothing, absolutely nothing, and you used it to destroy her life." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She'd known Dr. Winters was incompetent, but this was malicious. This was deliberate cruelty. Luke's arm came around her waist, holding her steady. "Are you saying," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that your mother paid a doctor to lie about my wife's fertility? To brand her as barren, knowing it would ruin her life?" "I'm saying exactly that," Edmund confirmed. He looked at Grace with tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Grace. I should have spoken up years ago. I should have told the truth, but I was a coward. I let my mother control me, and I let her destroy you. I'll never forgive myself for that." Agnes was shaking with rage. "You ungrateful, disloyal, how dare you air our family's private business in front of the entire town? How dare you side with this nobody over your own mother?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Edmund said simply. "Something I should have done 3 years ago." Grace stared at him, trying to process this revelation. Agnes Whitmore hadn't just believed Dr. Winters' diagnosis. She'd orchestrated it. She deliberately destroyed Grace's life because she didn't think the Weller family was good enough to marry into the prestigious Whitmore line. The rage that filled Grace then was unlike anything she'd ever felt. It burned through her veins like wildfire, consuming every other emotion until all she could feel was pure, incandescent fury. "You destroyed my life," she said, her voice shaking. "You took 3 years from me. 3 years of shame and isolation and pain. You made me believe I was worthless, broken, cursed. You made my own family sell me like property, all because you thought I wasn't good enough for your son." Agnes lifted her chin defiantly. "I was protecting my family," she said, "protecting our legacy. The Whitmores don't marry beneath their station." "Your station?" Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're the wife of a small-town pastor, Mrs. Whitmore. You're not nobility. You're not royalty. You're just a cruel, petty woman who gets her power from making other people feel small." She took a step closer, and Agnes actually backed away. "But here's what you don't understand," Grace continued. "You didn't break me. You tried. God knows you tried. But you failed. I survived your cruelty. I built a new life. I found real love with a real man who sees my worth without needing to tear anyone else down. And now I'm carrying his child. Proof that you and your lies have no power over me anymore." Agnes's face twisted with impotent rage. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You think coming back here, flaunting your condition, somehow vindicates you? You're still nothing, Grace Weller. Still a nobody from nowhere playing at being important." "Maybe," Grace agreed, "but I'm a nobody who's happy, who's loved, who's building a life that matters. Can you say the same, Mrs. Whitmore? Can you honestly say that all your status and respectability has brought you joy? Or are you just bitter and alone, clinging to your pride because it's all you have left?" The words landed like physical blows. Her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. For just a moment, she looked old and tired and desperately unhappy. Then the mask slammed back into place. "Get out," Agnes said coldly. "Get out of our town and don't come back. You're not welcome here." "I wouldn't stay if you paid me," Grace replied. She turned to address the crowd one final time. "To anyone who's been told they're not enough, by doctors, by family, by people like her, don't believe it. You are enough. You've always been enough, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve a place in your life." She mounted her horse with Luke's help, every eye in the square watching her. As they prepared to ride out, Grace's father took a halting step forward. "Grace," he called out, "please, I know I don't deserve it, but can you forgive me?" Grace looked down at him from her horse, this man who'd raised her and then sold her, who'd told her she was worthless, and then walked away without looking back. She felt Luke's questioning gaze on her, knew he'd support whatever she decided. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe someday, but not today. Today I'm still too angry. Today I still remember what it felt like to trudge through the snow behind your wagon, with a rope cutting into my wrists, knowing my own father valued me at exactly $50. Samuel's face crumpled. "I'll regret it until the day I die." "Good," Grace said, and there was no mercy in her voice. "You should. Maybe that regret will make you think twice before you judge someone else based on lies and prejudice." She gathered her reins, ready to leave this place and these people behind forever. But Thomas suddenly stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Grace, wait," he said. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but when the baby comes, would you let us know? Would you send word?" Grace considered him, her brother, who'd sat silently in the wagon while she'd been sold, who'd never once stood up for her or questioned their father's decision. But she also saw genuine remorse in his eyes, genuine hope that maybe, someday, they could repair what had been broken. "Maybe," she said finally, "if the baby's born healthy, if we're both well, maybe I'll send word. But don't expect anything more than that, Thomas. Don't expect me to come home for holidays or to let you be part of our lives. Some betrayals are too deep to overcome." Thomas nodded, accepting the boundary she'd set. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's more than I deserve." Grace looked at Luke, and he nodded. Together they turned their horses and rode out of Evergreen Hollow as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Behind them, Grace heard the explosion of voices as the crowd dissolved into chaos, everyone talking at once, processing the revelations that had just been laid bare. But Grace didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the road ahead, on the life she was building with Luke. The past was behind her now, and she refused to let it have any more power over her future. They rode in silence for a while, putting distance between themselves and the town. When they finally stopped to make camp, Luke helped Grace down from her horse and pulled her into his arms. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Grace thought about the question. Was she all right? She'd just confronted everyone who'd ever hurt her, had exposed the conspiracy that had destroyed her life, had walked away from her entire past without looking back. It should have felt devastating. It should have broken her. But instead she felt light, unburdened, free. "I'm better than all right," she said, smiling up at him. "I'm finally free of them. Free of their judgment, their cruelty, their lies. They don't own me anymore, Luke. They never will again." Luke kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I'm so damn proud of you," he murmured against her mouth. "The way you stood up to them, the way you refused to let them diminish you, you were magnificent." "I learned from the best," Grace replied, running her fingers through his beard. "You showed me what it means to survive with dignity, what it means to build a life on your own terms instead of accepting what other people think you deserve." They made camp in a small clearing off the road, building a fire and sharing a simple meal of dried meat and hard bread. As darkness fell and stars began appearing in the sky above them, Grace found herself thinking about Sarah Miller and all the other women who'd looked at her with such desperate hope. "I wish I could do more for them," she said quietly. "For women like Sarah who are going through what I went through. I wish I could save them all." Luke pulled her closer, wrapping a blanket around both of them against the cooling night air. "You did more than you realize," he said. "You showed them it's possible to survive, to fight back, to refuse to accept other people's definitions of who you are. That's not nothing, Grace. That's revolutionary." "Is it enough?" "It's a start." Luke kissed the top of her head. "And when our daughter is born—" "Daughter?" Grace interrupted, tilting her head to look at him. "What makes you so sure it's a girl?" Luke smiled. "Just a feeling. Call it a father's intuition, but when our daughter is born, she'll grow up knowing her mother was a warrior, that she fought against an entire town's prejudice and won. That's a legacy worth having." Grace settled back against his chest, his words warming her from the inside out. A daughter. A little girl who would grow up in a world where her mother had already blazed a trail, who would never have to doubt her own worth or accept anyone else's cruel judgment. "What should we name her?" Grace asked. "If it is a girl, I mean." Luke was quiet for a moment, considering. "Faith," he said finally. "We should name her Faith." Grace tested the name silently, rolling it around in her mind. Faith. It was perfect. A reminder that sometimes you had to believe in the impossible, that miracles happened when you least expected them, that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions. "Faith Carver," she said aloud. "Yes, I like that." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Grace found her hand drifting to her stomach, marveling at the life growing inside her. Just a few months ago, she'd been trudging through snow with bound wrists, believing herself worthless and broken. Now she was here, loved, valued, carrying a child that proved every awful thing anyone had ever said about her was a lie. "Luke?" she said softly. "Thank you. For buying me that day. For cutting my ropes and treating me like a person instead of property. For seeing me when everyone else looked through me. For loving me when I didn't think I deserved to be loved. Thank you for everything." Luke's arms tightened around her. "Grace, you've got it backwards. You've got it. Thank you for trusting me. For taking a chance on a broken-down widower living alone on a mountain. For bringing light back into my life when I thought I'd spend the rest of my days in darkness. You saved me as much as I saved you. Maybe more." Grace turned in his arms and kissed him deeply, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into the gesture. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go home," he said. "Back to our mountain. Back to our life." "Home?" Grace repeated, and realized it was true. The cabin on Carver's Ridge was home now, more home than the house in Evergreen Hollow had ever been. It was where she'd learned to laugh again, to hope again, to believe in herself again. It was where she'd found love and built a future worth having. Yes, she agreed. Let's go home. They set out the next morning, retracing their route back toward the mountains. The journey seemed shorter this time, perhaps because Grace knew what waited at the end. Not uncertainty or fear, but safety and love. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the cabin nestled in its clearing, Grace felt her heart swell with something close to joy. This was her life now, not the one she'd been born into or the one she'd been promised, but the one she'd chosen. And it was better than anything she'd dared to dream. Luke helped her down from her horse and immediately set about unpacking their supplies and seeing to the animals. Grace went inside and lit the fire, feeling the cabin warm around her like a welcoming embrace. Everything was just as they'd left it. The mismatched chairs, the repaired book of poetry, the bed where they'd first made love and confessed their feelings. She put on water to boil for tea and was standing at the window watching Luke work in the paddock when she felt it, a strange flutter in her belly, so faint she almost missed it. Grace froze, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. There it was again, a tiny movement, like butterfly wings brushing against her from the inside. "Luke," she called out, her voice shaking with excitement. "Luke, come quick!" He dropped what he was doing and ran to the cabin, bursting through the door with panic written across his face. "What's wrong? Are you hurt? Is it the baby?" "Give me your hand," Grace interrupted, grabbing his wrist and pressing his palm flat against her belly. "Wait, just wait." They stood there frozen, barely breathing, Luke's hand warm and solid against the slight swell of her stomach. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Grace felt it again, that delicate flutter, and saw Luke's eyes go wide. "Was that the baby?" Grace confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "Luke, that was our baby moving." Luke dropped to his knees in front of her, pressing his cheek against her belly, his arms wrapping around her waist. Grace heard him make a sound that was half laugh, half sob, felt his shoulders shake with emotion. "Hello, little one," he whispered against her dress. "Hello, Faith. Your daddy's here. Your mama's here. We're both here, and we love you so much already." Grace ran her fingers through his hair, her own tears falling freely now. This moment, this perfect, precious moment, was everything she'd been denied when the town had declared her barren. The joy of feeling life move inside her, of sharing that miracle with someone who loved her unconditionally, of knowing that soon she'd hold her daughter in her arms. "We're going to be parents," she said wonderingly. Luke looked up at her, his face wet with tears and split by a grin so wide it looked almost painful. "We're going to be parents," he repeated. Then he stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and protested that he'd make her dizzy. When he finally set her down, he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Grace felt her heart might burst from the sheer fullness of her love for this man. "I promise you," Luke said fiercely, "I promise our daughter will grow up knowing she's loved, that she's wanted, that her worth isn't tied to what anyone else thinks she should be. She'll grow up strong and brave and confident, just like her mother. And kind and protective and steadfast, just like her father," Grace added. They stood there in their small cabin, wrapped in each other's arms, feeling their baby move between them. Outside, spring was giving way to summer, the world bursting with new life and new possibilities. The winter that had brought Grace to this mountain felt like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person entirely. That broken girl who'd trudged through the snow with bound wrists didn't exist anymore. In her place stood a woman who'd learned her own strength, who'd fought back against cruelty and won, who'd built a life worth living on her own terms. Grace Carver. Wife, soon-to-be mother, survivor, warrior. She had everything she'd ever wanted, and none of it looked the way she'd once imagined. But that was all right. That was better than all right. Because this life, messy and imperfect and hard-won, was hers, and no one could ever take that away from her again. Summer settled over the mountain like a blessing, bringing with it warm days and cool nights that made the cabin feel like a sanctuary from the rest of the world. Grace's belly grew steadily rounder, and with each passing week the baby became more active, kicking and rolling in ways that made both her and Luke laugh with delight and wonder. Luke had transformed into the most attentive husband Grace could have imagined. He insisted she rest more, work less, and constantly fretted over whether she was eating enough, sleeping enough, staying cool enough in the summer heat. It would have been suffocating if it hadn't been so clearly born from love and the memory of the wife and child he'd lost. "I'm not made of glass," Grace reminded him one afternoon when he'd physically lifted her away from the washing she'd been doing. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can handle a little laundry." "Not in this heat," Luke said firmly, steering her toward the shade of the porch. "Sit. Rest. I'll finish the washing." Grace watched in amusement as her mountain man husband, this rough, capable rancher who could wrestle a calf to the ground and chop wood all day without breaking a sweat, carefully scrubbed her dresses in the wash basin with the same concentration he'd give to shoeing a horse. "You're going to spoil me," she called out. "Good," Luke replied without looking up. "You deserve to be spoiled." The baby kicked hard against Grace's ribs, as if agreeing with her father, and Grace laughed. "Your daughter agrees with you," she said, rubbing the spot where a tiny foot was pressing against her belly. Luke abandoned the washing immediately and came to sit beside her, his large hand replacing hers on her stomach. "Is she kicking?" he asked eagerly, and Grace guided his hand to the right spot. They sat there together, feeling their daughter move, and Grace thought she'd never been happier in her entire life. But that happiness was shadowed by a growing anxiety that Grace tried to hide but couldn't quite suppress. As summer progressed and her due date drew closer, she found herself thinking more and more about Anna, Luke's first wife, who died in childbirth along with their son. Luke never spoke about the details, and Grace had never pushed him to share, but she'd pieced together enough from his careful avoidance of the subject to understand that it had been traumatic and terrible. One night in late July, Grace woke from a nightmare gasping and drenched in sweat. She'd dreamed of blood and pain and Luke's anguished screams, had seen herself dying while he watched helplessly, had felt the life drain from her body while their baby cried somewhere in the darkness. "Grace, Grace, what's wrong?" Luke was instantly awake, lighting the lamp with shaking hands. "Is it the baby? Are you in pain?" "Just a dream," Grace managed, but her voice was shaking. "Just a bad dream." Luke pulled her into his arms, and that's when she broke. Great, heaving sobs that she'd been holding back for weeks. All her fear and anxiety came pouring out in an unstoppable flood. "What if something goes wrong?" she gasped against his chest. "What if I die like Anna did? What if the baby? What if I can't do this, Luke? What if my body fails me after all?" Hey, stop," Luke said, his voice rough with his own emotion. He pulled back to cup her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me, Grace. You're not Anna. This isn't the same situation. Anna had complications from the very beginning. Bleeding, weakness, pain. You've been healthy and strong this entire time. Dr. Harrison said everything looked perfect." "But things can change," Grace whispered. "Things can go wrong so quickly, and if they do, we'll handle it," Luke interrupted firmly. "But Grace, you can't spend the next 3 months terrified of something that probably won't happen. You'll drive yourself mad, and it's not good for you or the baby." Grace knew he was right, but knowing didn't make the fear go away. "Tell me what happened," she said quietly. "With Anna. I need to know what I'm facing, what you're afraid of." Luke's face went pale in the lamplight. "Grace, please," she pressed. "Not knowing is worse. My imagination is filling in the blanks with all sorts of horrors. The truth, no matter how bad, has to be better than what I'm imagining." Luke was silent for so long that Grace thought he might refuse. But then he took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice distant and hollow, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. "Anna started having problems around her 6th month," he said. "Bleeding that wouldn't stop. The midwife said it wasn't normal but might resolve on its own. It didn't. She got weaker and weaker, could barely get out of bed toward the end. When the labor started, it was too early, almost 2 months too early. The baby wasn't ready, Anna wasn't ready." His hands tightened on Grace's shoulders, but his eyes were fixed on something far away, some terrible memory only he could see. "It took 3 days," he continued, and his voice broke. 3 days of labor, and she was already so weak. I rode down to town to get the doctor, but by the time we got back, the baby was born dead. Had been dead for hours, the midwife said. And Anna, she just kept bleeding. Nothing they did could stop it. She died in my arms, asking me to take care of our son, not understanding that he was already gone. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. She reached up to touch Luke's cheek and found it wet. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Luke, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I blame myself," Luke said hoarsely. "I kept thinking, if I'd gotten her to a better doctor sooner, if I'd had more money for proper care, if I'd noticed the signs earlier." "It wasn't your fault," Grace said fiercely, echoing the words he'd once said to her. "Sometimes terrible things happen, and there's no one to blame. Just loss." Luke let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You remember that, do you?" "I remember everything you've ever said to me." Grace pressed her forehead against his. "And now I understand why you're so protective, why you panic every time I exert myself. You're afraid of losing me the way you lost her." "Every day," Luke admitted, "every single day I wake up terrified that something will go wrong, that I'll lose you both, that I'll have to live through that nightmare again." "Look at me," Grace commanded, and Luke obeyed. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the baby was moving restlessly, disturbed by her mother's emotional state. "Feel that? That's your daughter, alive and healthy and strong. And I'm healthy and strong too. What happened to Anna was a tragedy, but it doesn't mean the same thing will happen to me." "I know that logically," Luke said, "but logic doesn't help when I wake up in the middle of the night and check to make sure you're still breathing. It doesn't help when I see you wince from a kick and my first thought is that something's wrong." Grace understood then just how deep his trauma ran, how much courage it had taken for him to open his heart again, to risk loving someone new when he'd lost so much the first time. "We're going to get through this," she said firmly. "Both of us. Together. And when our daughter is born, healthy and screaming and perfect, you're going to realize that not every story ends in tragedy. Promise me," Luke said suddenly, desperately. "Promise me that if something goes wrong, if it comes down to saving you or saving the baby—" "Don't," Grace interrupted. "Don't ask me to make that choice." "I have to," Luke said, his voice breaking. "Grace, I need to know that you'll fight for yourself, that you won't give up trying to survive, because I can't lose you. I won't survive it a second time." Grace saw the raw terror in his eyes and understood that this wasn't just about her or the baby. This was about Luke's very survival, about whether he could endure another loss of this magnitude. And the truth was, she didn't know if he could. "I promise," she said quietly. "I promise to fight, to do everything in my power to come back to you. But Luke, you have to promise me something too. Anything. If the worst happens, and I'm not saying it will, but if it does, you have to promise you won't let it destroy you, that you'll keep living, that you'll take care of our daughter and tell her about both of us, about the love that made her. Promise me you won't just give up." Luke's jaw clenched. That's not a fair thing to ask. "Neither is making me promise to survive," Grace countered. "But we're making these promises anyway because we love each other, because we need to know the other person will be all right." They stared at each other in the lamplight, two people who'd been broken by life once before and were terrified of being broken again. Finally, Luke nodded. "I promise," he said hoarsely. "I promise I'll keep going, for you, for Faith, even if it kills me to do it." Grace kissed him then, tasting salt from both their tears. They held each other until the lamp burned low and the first hints of dawn began lightening the sky outside their window. Neither of them slept, but somehow sharing their fears had made them more bearable. They'd acknowledged the worst possibilities, had made their promises to each other, and now all they could do was trust that love would be enough to see them through. The weeks that followed were both endless and too short. August burned hot and heavy, making Grace feel like she was carrying a boulder instead of a baby. She waddled more than walked, her back ached constantly, and she had to stop working entirely because even the smallest tasks left her breathless and exhausted. Luke had ridden down to the valley in late July and returned with Mrs. Chen, an experienced midwife from one of the Chinese families that had settled in the area after the railroad work dried up. She was a small, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who took one look at Grace and pronounced her fit and healthy. "Baby is big," Mrs. Chen said, her hands expertly probing Grace's belly. "Strong. You carry well. No problems I can see." "When?" Grace asked. "When will the baby come?" Mrs. Chen shrugged. "Baby comes when baby is ready." Maybe 2 weeks, maybe 4. First babies like to take their time. She set up a small room in the barn loft, explaining that she preferred to be close by in case labor started suddenly. Luke had offered to let her stay in the cabin, but Mrs. Chen had waved off the suggestion. "You are newlyweds," she said with a knowing smile. "You need privacy. I am fine in the loft. Very comfortable. You call when baby comes." Grace liked Mrs. Chen immediately. The woman had a calm, steady presence that soothed Grace's anxieties in a way that no amount of Luke's reassurance could quite manage. Mrs. Chen had delivered hundreds of babies, had seen every complication imaginable, and she radiated quiet confidence that things would proceed normally. "You worry too much," Mrs. Chen told Grace during one of her daily visits. "Worry is not good for baby. You need to relax, trust your body. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Your body knows what to do." "What if it doesn't?" Grace asked quietly. "What if something goes wrong?" Mrs. Chen fixed her with a sharp look. "Then I fix it. That is why I am here. But Grace, you cannot spend these weeks afraid. Fear makes labor harder, makes pain worse. You need to make peace with what is coming. Accept that there will be pain, yes, but also joy. Accept that your body will do hard work, but it is strong work, good work. Accept that at the end, you will hold your baby. Focus on that." Grace tried to take the advice to heart. She spent her days resting in the shade, reading poetry aloud to her belly, talking to Faith about the life they would build together. Luke brought her wildflowers he picked on his rides around the property, and she pressed them between the pages of books, creating small treasures to show their daughter someday. In early September, on a morning that dawned clear and cool with the first hint of autumn in the air, Grace woke to feel something different. Not pain exactly, but a tightening across her belly that made her catch her breath. She lay still, waiting to see if it would happen again. 10 minutes later, it did. Grace's heart began to race. This was it. After 9 months of waiting and wondering and preparing, their daughter had decided it was time to be born. "Luke," she said quietly, and he was instantly awake, every muscle tensed for action. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Grace said, managing a smile despite her nervousness. "I think the baby's coming." Luke went pale, then flushed, then pale again. "Now? Right now?" "Not right this second, but soon. The contractions have started." Luke was on his feet immediately, pulling on clothes with shaking hands. "I'll get Mrs. Chen. You stay here. Don't move. Don't—" "Luke," Grace interrupted, catching his hand. "Breathe. We have time." Mrs. Chen said first babies take a while. This could go on for hours. "Or it could go fast," Luke said, and she could hear the panic threading through his voice. "Anna's labor was 3 days, but I've heard of women who deliver in an hour, and—" "Stop," Grace said firmly. "Listen to me. Everything is going to be fine. Mrs. Chen is prepared. You're prepared. I'm prepared. This is what we've been waiting for. So take a breath, get the midwife, and come back to me. All right?" Luke nodded jerkily, pressed a hard kiss to her forehead, and practically ran out the door. Grace heard him shouting for Mrs. Chen as he sprinted toward the barn, and despite everything, she found herself smiling. Her strong, capable husband, reduced to a nervous wreck at the prospect of becoming a father. Mrs. Chen arrived within minutes, completely unruffled despite having been woken from sleep. She did a quick examination, timing Grace's contractions, and nodded in satisfaction. "Good strong contractions," she announced. "Steady rhythm. This baby will come tonight, I think. Maybe early tomorrow morning." "That long?" Luke asked, looking stricken. Mrs. Chen patted his arm. "First babies always take time. Is normal. You need to be patient." She turned to Grace. "Can you walk?" "I think so." "Good. Walking helps labor progress. We walk, we rest, we walk more. When contractions get stronger, then we work harder. But for now, we take it easy." The hours that followed were strange, simultaneously the longest and shortest of Grace's life. The contractions came in waves, starting as mild tightening and gradually building in intensity until Grace had to stop and breathe through them. Mrs. Chen guided her through various positions, walking, sitting, squatting, lying on her side, explaining that movement helped the baby descend and made labor faster. Luke hovered constantly, looking like he might collapse from stress at any moment. Mrs. Chen finally shooed him outside to chop wood, explaining that he needed something to do with his nervous energy, or he'd drive them both mad. Men are useless during labor, she said matter-of-factly. They pace and worry and get in the way. Better to give them work. Grace could hear the rhythmic thunk of the axe outside and found it oddly comforting. Luke was out there, working off his fear and anxiety while she did the hard work of bringing their child into the world. They were in this together, even if they were physically separated. By afternoon, the contractions were coming faster and harder. Grace had to grip the bedpost and breathe in slow, measured counts, while pain radiated across her belly and down her back. Mrs. Chen pressed warm cloths against her lower back, murmuring encouragement in a mixture of English and Chinese that Grace found soothing even when she couldn't understand the words. "You're doing beautifully," Mrs. Chen said during a break between contractions. "Baby is moving down. Everything is progressing well." "How much longer?" Grace gasped. "Hard to say. Few more hours, maybe. Your body is working hard, doing good work." Luke came in as the sun was setting, his face haggard with worry. "Is she all right?" he asked Mrs. Chen. "Should it be taking this long?" "She is fine," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Labor takes as long as it takes. No rushing." Luke knelt beside the bed where Grace was resting between contractions and took her hand. "I'm right here," he said softly. "Right here with you." Grace squeezed his fingers. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know. Me too." Luke pressed his forehead against her knuckles. "But Mrs. Chen says everything's going well. You're doing exactly what you need to do. Just a little longer, and we'll meet our daughter." The next contraction hit, stronger than any that had come before, and Grace cried out despite herself. Luke's face went white, but he held her hand and let her squeeze until she thought she might break his fingers. When it passed, she was trembling and exhausted. "I can't do this," she gasped. "It's too much. I can't." "Yes, you can," Mrs. Chen said sharply. "You're already doing it. No giving up now. Baby is almost here." Another contraction, and another, and another. They came faster now, barely giving Grace time to catch her breath between them. The pain was overwhelming, consuming, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She heard herself making sounds she didn't recognize. Animal sounds, primal and raw. "I need to push," she gasped suddenly. "Mrs. Chen, I need to—" "Not yet," Mrs. Chen said, examining her quickly. "Almost, but not quite. Breathe through it. Pant if you need to, but don't push yet." It was agony trying not to push when every fiber of her being was screaming at her to do exactly that. Grace gripped Luke's hand so hard she felt something pop. But he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just kept murmuring encouragement, telling her how strong she was, how proud he was, how much he loved her. "Now," Mrs. Chen said finally. "Now you can push. Next contraction, you push hard." Grace barely had time to register the words before the next wave hit. She bore down with everything she had, feeling something shift and move inside her. Luke supported her back. Mrs. Chen guided her through the push, and for one perfect moment, they were all working together toward a single goal. "Good!" Mrs. Chen exclaimed. "Very good! Again on the next one." Push after push after push. Grace lost track of time, lost track of everything except the need to get this baby out, to finish what her body had started 9 months ago. Sweat poured down her face, her hair stuck to her neck, her throat was raw from crying out. But she kept going. She'd promised Luke she would fight, and she was keeping that promise with every ounce of strength she possessed. "Head is out," Mrs. Chen announced. "One more big push, Grace. You can do this." Grace gathered every last bit of energy she had left and pushed with a force that felt like it might split her apart. She felt a sudden release, a lessening of pressure, and then a cry. Thin and reedy and absolutely perfect, cutting through the night air like a declaration of existence. "It's a girl," Mrs. Chen said, laughing with delight. "Beautiful, healthy girl." Grace collapsed back against Luke's chest, sobbing with relief and joy and exhaustion. Luke was crying too, his tears falling onto her face as he held her and repeated, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," over and over, like a prayer. Mrs. Chen worked quickly, cleaning the baby and wrapping her in a soft blanket before placing her on Grace's chest. Grace looked down at her daughter, at Faith, and felt her heart simply stop. She was perfect. Impossibly, miraculously perfect. Tiny fingers already curling into fists, eyes scrunched closed against the lamplight, a shock of dark hair plastered to her small head. She was real and alive and here, after months of hoping and fearing and praying. "Hello, Faith," Grace whispered, tracing one finger down her daughter's soft cheek. "Hello, my beautiful girl. We've been waiting for you." Faith's eyes opened, just for a moment, and Grace saw they were pale gray, exactly like her father's. The baby made a small mewling sound, and Luke reached down to touch her tiny hand with one rough, calloused finger. Faith's fist immediately closed around it, gripping tight. "She's got a good grip," Luke said, his voice thick with tears. "Strong girl, just like her mama." Mrs. Chen finished her work and stepped back with a satisfied nod. "Mother and baby both healthy," she announced. "Good birth, good outcome. You did well, Grace." Grace barely heard her. She was lost in the wonder of her daughter, counting tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of miniature ears and the impossibly small nose. This was what everyone had said she could never have. This was what Dr. Winters had declared impossible, what her family had given up on, what the entire town of Evergreen Hollow had used to define her worth. And yet here Faith was, proof that they'd all been catastrophically wrong. "I can't believe she's real," Grace murmured. "I can't believe we actually did this." Luke kissed Grace's temple, then leaned down to press the gentlest kiss to Faith's forehead. "We did more than that," he said softly. "We proved them all wrong. Every single person who ever said you were broken or worthless or cursed, this baby is proof they were lying. You were never the problem, Grace. You were just waiting for the right person, the right time, the right love." Grace looked up at him through her tears. "The right everything," she agreed. "Mrs." Chen bustled around cleaning up, giving them privacy to bond with their new daughter. After a while, she approached the bed with a cup of tea for Grace. "You need to drink," she said. "Then sleep. Baby will want to eat soon, and you need your strength." Grace obeyed, drinking the warm tea while Faith dozed on her chest, one tiny hand fisted in Grace's nightgown. Luke hadn't moved from his position beside them, seemed unable to take his eyes off his daughter. "She's so small," he kept saying. "How can something this small be so perfect?" "Because she's made from love," Grace replied. "The strongest kind of love. The kind that survives betrayal and loss and cruelty. The kind that builds homes in the wilderness and faces down entire towns and refuses to give up even when everything seems impossible." Luke's eyes met hers over Faith's sleeping form. "I love you," he said simply. "I don't have better words than that. Just, I love you. Thank you for this. For her. For everything." "I love you too," Grace said. "And I'm so glad I get to build this life with you. That our daughter gets to grow up with a father who's kind and strong and who'll teach her that her worth comes from who she is, not what anyone else thinks she should be." Mrs. Chen returned then and gently took Faith from Grace's arms. "Time for baby to eat," she announced. "Then everyone sleeps. Tomorrow you start your new life as parents, but tonight you rest." She showed Grace how to nurse, guiding the process with patient expertise until Faith latched on and began to feed. The sensation was strange but not unpleasant, and Grace felt a fierce rush of maternal protectiveness as she watched her daughter nurse. This was her child, her flesh and blood, the baby everyone said she could never have, and Grace would protect her with every breath in her body, would make sure Faith never felt unwanted or worthless or less than, would raise her to be strong and confident and sure of her own value. When Faith had finished eating and drifted back to sleep, Mrs. Chen placed her in the small cradle Luke had built weeks ago. "Everyone sleeps now," she ordered. "I will stay close in case baby wakes, but you need rest, Grace. Your body has done hard work." Grace wanted to protest, wanted to stay awake and stare at her daughter, to convince herself this wasn't all a dream, but exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. Luke stretched out beside her on the bed, his arm curving around her protectively, and Grace let herself sink into sleep with the sound of Faith's soft breathing filling the room. She woke several times during the night to feed Faith, each time marveling anew that this perfect creature was really hers. Luke woke with her every time, watching as she nursed their daughter, sometimes reaching out to touch Faith's soft hair with wondering fingers. "I can't believe she's real," he kept saying. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find it was all a dream." "She's real," Grace assured him. "We're real. This whole impossible, wonderful life we've built, it's all real." Morning came with golden light streaming through the window. Mrs. Chen appeared with breakfast and pronounced both mother and baby to be thriving. "I will stay a few more days," she said. "Make sure everything continues well. Then I go home, and you are on your own." "Thank you," Grace said, meaning it with her whole heart. "Thank you for being here, for helping bring her safely into the world." Mrs. Chen smiled. "It's my honor," she said simply. "New life is always a blessing, especially a life as wanted as this one." Over the next few days, Grace and Luke learned the rhythms of parenthood. The sleepless nights, the constant feedings, the anxiety that came with being responsible for something so small and vulnerable. But they also learned the joys. Faith's first real smile, the way she curled into Grace's neck when she was upset, the sound of Luke's deep voice singing lullabies he claimed not to remember from his own childhood. True to her word, Mrs. Chen left after 3 days, satisfied that Grace was healing well and Faith was thriving. Before she departed, she gave Grace detailed instructions on caring for the baby and warning signs to watch for. "If you have any problems, you send for me," she said firmly. "But I do not think you will. You are strong, Mama. This baby is lucky to have you." After Mrs. Chen left, Grace stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching Luke work with the horses while Faith slept in her arms. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter. In a few months, the snow would return, and they'd be isolated again on their mountain. But this time, they wouldn't be alone. This time, they'd have Faith. Grace thought about the girl she'd been 9 months ago. Broken, worthless, sold by her own family, and trudging through snow toward an uncertain future. That girl would never have believed she'd end up here. Loved, valued, holding her own miracle baby while her husband worked nearby, and their whole future stretched out before them like an open road. "What are you thinking about?" Luke asked, appearing beside her with hay in his hair and dirt on his hands. Grace smiled up at him. "How far we've come," she said. "How much has changed?" Luke looked down at Faith, his expression softening. "Everything has changed," he agreed, "and it's all because of you, because you were brave enough to trust me, to build this life with me." "We built it together," Grace corrected. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around both her and Faith. They stood there in the doorway, a small family carved out of loss and pain, and the stubborn refusal to accept anyone else's definition of who they should be. And as Faith stirred in her arms and opened those pale gray eyes, Grace felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace, contentment, the bone-deep knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the people she was meant to love. This was home. This was family. This was everything. October painted the mountain in shades of gold and crimson, and Faith grew stronger with each passing day. She'd already developed a personality that made both Grace and Luke laugh, stubborn when hungry, curious about everything, and possessing a set of lungs that could wake them from the deepest sleep. Grace had never been so exhausted or so happy in her entire life. One crisp morning, as Grace nursed Faith by the window while watching Luke mend fences in the distance, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart jumped into her throat. They rarely had visitors, and unexpected company on the mountain usually meant trouble. Luke had heard it too. He dropped his tools and moved toward the cabin with the fluid speed of a man who'd learned to be cautious. Grace stood, cradling Faith protectively, and moved away from the window. "Stay inside," Luke called out as he reached for the rifle he kept by the door. "Don't come out until I say it's safe." Grace's pulse hammered as she watched through the gap in the curtain. A single rider crested the ridge, and Grace's breath caught when she recognized him. Thomas. Her brother. Luke must have recognized him too because he lowered the rifle slightly, though he didn't put it away. Thomas reined in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin, hands clearly visible and empty. "I come in peace," Thomas called out. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I heard that Grace had the baby. I wanted to see if it was true, if she and the child were well." Grace made her decision in an instant. She adjusted Faith in her arms and stepped out onto the porch, despite Luke's quick sound of protest. Thomas's eyes went immediately to the bundle in her arms, and his face transformed with wonder and something that might have been regret. "She's real," he said softly. "Grace, she's real." "Her name is Faith," Grace replied, her voice cool but not hostile. "And yes, she's very real, very healthy. Very much proof that everything we were told was a lie." Thomas dismounted slowly, and Luke tensed, but Grace shook her head slightly. Her brother approached the porch with his hat in his hands, looking younger and more uncertain than Grace had ever seen him. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and his voice cracked. "Grace, I'm so sorry for everything. For not standing up to Father, for letting him sell you like that, for believing the lies about you. He stopped, swallowing hard. "There's no excuse for what we did, what I did. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." Grace studied him, this brother who'd shared her childhood, who taught her to skip stones and catch fireflies, who'd sat silently in that wagon while she was sold away. She saw genuine remorse in his eyes, genuine pain, but she also remembered the rope cutting into her wrists, the cold that had seeped into her bones, the crushing weight of believing she was worthless. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, "but I'm not sure I can forgive you yet. Maybe someday, but not today." Thomas nodded, accepting the boundary. "That's fair, more than fair." His eyes drifted back to Faith. May I see her? Just for a moment?" Grace hesitated, then descended the porch steps. Luke moved to her side immediately, his presence a wall of protection. She adjusted Faith's blanket so Thomas could see her face, those pale gray eyes wide and curious, that shock of dark hair, those perfect tiny features. "She's beautiful," Thomas whispered. "She looks like you, Grace. Around the eyes." "She looks like her father, too," Grace said, glancing at Luke with a soft smile. "She's got his stubbornness, that's for certain." Thomas reached out as if to touch Faith, then seemed to think better of it and dropped his hand. "Mother doesn't know I'm here," he said quietly. She's not well, Grace. What happened in the town square, what Edmund revealed about Mrs. Whitmore. It broke something in her. She spends most days in bed now, staring at the wall. Won't eat, won't talk, just stares." Grace felt a complicated swirl of emotions at that news. Part of her felt vindicated. Her mother deserved to feel some of the pain she'd caused. But another part, the part that remembered being held as a child, that remembered her mother's lullabies and gentle hands, felt a stab of unwanted sympathy. "And Father?" she asked. "Drinks," Thomas said bluntly. "From morning until night. He sold the Southfield to pay debts. We're struggling, Grace. The whole family is falling apart." He looked at her with desperate eyes. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty or to ask for help. I thought you should know, thought you deserved to know that what they did to you has consequences." "It's not my job to fix them," Grace said firmly, though her voice softened slightly. "They made their choices. They have to live with them." "I know." Thomas twisted his hat in his hands. "I just wanted you to know that we're paying for what we did, and that He stopped, his voice breaking again. "Miss you, Grace. I miss my sister. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I miss you." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. This was the brother she remembered, the one who'd defended her against bullies, who'd sneaked her extra dessert, who'd told her stories to chase away nightmares, the one who'd failed her when she needed him most. "I miss you too," she admitted quietly. "I miss who we used to be, before everything went wrong. But Thomas, I can't go back to being that person. Too much has happened. I've built a new life here, and I won't risk it to repair something that might be too broken to fix." "I understand." Thomas put his hat back on, preparing to leave. Will you send word sometimes? Let us know you're all right. Let us know how Faith is growing." Grace looked at Luke, who nodded slightly, leaving the decision to her. She considered Thomas's request, weighing her anger against the small kernel of love that still remained for the brother he'd once been. "Maybe," she said finally. "Once a year, perhaps. A letter at Christmas. But that's all I can promise right now." Thomas's face brightened with hope. That's more than I deserve. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for even considering it. He mounted his horse, then paused to look back at them one more time. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you found happiness. Glad you found someone who sees your worth. And I'm glad that baby exists because she's proof that you were right all along. About everything. He rode away before Grace could respond, disappearing back down the mountain trail. Grace stood watching until he was gone, Faith warm and solid in her arms, Luke's hand steady on her back. Are you all right? Luke asked quietly. Grace considered the question. Was she all right? Her family was broken. Her mother was ill. Her father had become a drunk. Part of her felt guilty, as if her defiance had somehow caused their downfall. But the larger part, the part that had been forged in pain and reborn in love, knew the truth. I'm all right, she said firmly. They're not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to you and Faith, to this life we've built. Everything else is just noise. Luke kissed her temple. That's my Grace, he murmured, always knowing what matters. They went back inside, and Grace settled into her rocking chair to finish nursing Faith. As she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain and betrayal, yes, but also the unexpected grace of finding Luke, the miracle of conceiving Faith, the triumph of proving everyone wrong. Her story could have ended so differently. She could have frozen to death in the wilderness, or died in childbirth like Anna, or simply withered away under the weight of shame and rejection. But she hadn't. She'd survived. She'd fought. She'd built something beautiful out of the ashes of her old life. And now she had everything she'd ever wanted, even if it looked nothing like what she'd once imagined. The first snow came in early November, just after Faith turned 2 months old. Grace stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down in lazy spirals, remembering the last time she'd seen snow falling like this. She'd been trudging behind a wagon, wrists bound, believing herself worthless and broken. And now here she stood, loved, valued, holding her daughter while her husband built up the fire to keep them all warm. Winter's here, Luke said, coming to stand beside her. He wrapped his arms around both of them, and Grace leaned back against his solid warmth. Are you ready for it? Grace thought about the months ahead, the isolation, the cold, the long dark nights. But she also thought about the three of them together in this cabin, safe and warm and loved, about reading poetry by firelight while Faith slept, about Luke's stories and her cooking and the small perfect moments that made up a life worth living. I'm ready, she said, more than ready. This winter will be different from the last one. How so? Because last winter we were two broken people just trying to survive. But this winter, we're a family, and that changes everything. Luke pressed a kiss to her hair. Everything, he agreed. The months that followed were hard in the way that all mountain winters were hard. Snow that piled up to the windows, cold that crept through every crack in the walls, days when the wind howled so fiercely that venturing outside meant risking frostbite or worse. But they were also some of the happiest months of Grace's life. Faith grew and changed almost daily, her personality blossoming in ways that delighted and occasionally frustrated her parents. She was loud when she wanted attention, stubborn when she didn't get her way, but also surprisingly gentle, reaching out to touch Grace's face with wondering fingers, making cooing sounds when Luke sang to her, smiling that gummy baby smile that made all the sleepless nights worthwhile. Luke proved to be a devoted father in ways that sometimes brought tears to Grace's eyes. He'd walk Faith around the cabin for hours when she was fussy, bouncing her gently and murmuring nonsense that somehow always seemed to work. He'd fashion toys for her out of wood and leather, simple things that Faith seemed to find endlessly fascinating. And at night, he'd hold his daughter while Grace read poetry, the three of them curled together by the fire like they were the only people left in the world. In late December, Grace kept her promise to Thomas and wrote a brief letter describing Faith's progress and assuring her brother that they were all well. She gave it to Luke to mail the next time he made the dangerous trip down to the valley for supplies, and tried not to think too much about what reaction it might provoke back in Evergreen Hollow. The response came in late January, a letter from Thomas filled with gratitude and updates about the family. Their mother had improved slightly, he wrote, though she still rarely left her room. Their father had stopped drinking quite so much but remained a shell of his former self. The town was still gossiping about the revelations from the previous spring, and the Whitmore family's reputation had suffered considerably. "Do you want to write back?" Luke asked after Grace read the letter aloud. Grace thought about it, then shook her head. "Next Christmas," she said. "One letter a year, like I promised. That's enough." She folded the letter and put it away in a drawer, a record of a past life that felt increasingly distant. Her real life was here, in this cabin, with Luke and Faith. Everything else was just echoes. Winter finally loosened its grip in March, and by April, the snow had retreated enough for them to venture out more freely. Grace strapped Faith to her chest in a sling Mrs. Chen had taught her to make and walked with Luke around the property, showing their daughter the world she'd been born into. Faith stared at everything with wide, wondering eyes, the horses, the cattle, the trees coming back to life after their winter dormancy. "She's going to grow up wild," Luke said, watching Faith reach out to touch a budding branch. "Free and strong and completely untamed by anyone's expectations." "Good," Grace replied. "That's exactly how she should grow up. No one will ever make her feel like she has to be anything other than herself." One warm afternoon in May, when Faith was 8 months old and just beginning to pull herself up on furniture, Grace was outside hanging laundry when she heard riders approaching. Multiple riders this time, and Grace's heart jumped with alarm. She gathered Faith quickly and ran toward the cabin, calling for Luke. He emerged with the rifle, his face set and grim. They watched as 3 riders crested the ridge, and Grace's breath caught when she recognized not just Thomas, but also Dr. Harrison from Silver Creek and a younger man she didn't know. Thomas raised his hands in a gesture of peace as they approached. "Grace, Luke, please don't shoot. We're not here to cause trouble. Dr. Harrison asked to come, and I offered to guide him. This is his assistant, Dr. Wells." Grace looked at Dr. Harrison in confusion. "Why would you come all this way?" The kindly physician dismounted and approached slowly, mindful of Luke's rifle. "Because word of your daughter's birth has spread, Mrs. Carver. And because Dr. Winters' gross incompetence and deliberate malpractice needed to be addressed formally. I've been gathering testimony from women he's misdiagnosed over the years, and your case, combined with Edmund Whitmore's public admission about his mother's conspiracy, has given me enough evidence to have his medical license revoked." Grace stared at him. "His license? You can do that?" "The state medical board can, and they will, based on my report." Dr. Harrison smiled gently. "But I wanted to examine your daughter first, to document that she exists, that she's healthy, that you were never barren at all. Your case will be the centerpiece of my report, Mrs. Carver. You'll help ensure that Dr. Winters can never hurt another woman the way he hurt you." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd come back to Evergreen Hollow to prove them wrong, to show them her pregnancy. But she'd never imagined that her defiance would lead to actual justice, to preventing other women from suffering the same fate. "You can examine her," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "You can document whatever you need. If it helps other women, if it stops him from destroying more lives, then yes, absolutely yes." Dr. Harrison and his assistant spent an hour examining Faith, measuring her, documenting her perfect health and development. They also interviewed Grace about her pregnancy and birth, about Dr. Winters' original examination and diagnosis, about the years of shame and isolation that had followed his pronouncement. When they were finished, Dr. Harrison clasped Grace's hand warmly. "Thank you," he said. "Your courage in coming back to that town, in standing up to those people, it's made all the difference. Dr. Winters will face consequences for what he's done, and the women he's harmed will have validation that they weren't the problem. That's because of you, Mrs. Carver." After the doctors left, Thomas lingered behind. He looked at Grace hesitantly. "Mother wants to meet her," he said quietly. "Faith, I mean, she's been asking every day since Christmas. I know you don't owe her anything, but—" "No," Grace interrupted firmly. "Thomas, I appreciate that Mother is feeling regret now, but she had 9 months to reach out during my pregnancy. She had 8 months since Faith was born. She chose not to. And I'm not going to subject my daughter to someone who might still believe she's somehow tainted or cursed because of how the town talked about me." "She doesn't believe that anymore," Thomas protested. "She knows she was wrong. She wants a chance to apologize, to try to make things right. Some things can't be made right, Grace said, though her voice was gentle. Some betrayals cut too deep. Tell Mother I'm glad she's feeling better. Tell her I hope she finds peace. But I can't let her back into my life, Thomas. The risk is too great. I won't let anyone make Faith feel the way I was made to feel. Not ever. Thomas nodded sadly. I understand. I'll tell her. He mounted his horse, then looked back one more time. For what it's worth, Grace, I think you're an amazing mother. Faith is lucky to have you. She's lucky to have both of us, Grace corrected, reaching for Luke's hand. That's what real family looks like. People who choose each other, who protect each other, who refuse to let the world define their worth. Tell Mother that. Tell her that blood doesn't make family. Love does. Thomas rode away, and Grace watched him go with mixed feelings. She didn't regret her decision. Protecting Faith was paramount. But part of her mourned the family she'd once had, the mother who'd once tucked her in at night and kissed her scraped knees. You did the right thing, Luke said quietly. I know, Grace replied. It just doesn't always feel good, doing the right thing. No, Luke agreed, but that's what makes it right. If it was easy, it wouldn't mean anything. Summer returned with its warmth and long days, and Faith celebrated her first birthday with a cake Grace made from their precious stores of sugar and flour. The baby, not quite a baby anymore, smashed her chubby hands into the frosting and laughed with pure delight, and Grace and Luke laughed with her, capturing this perfect moment in their memories. Faith took her first steps in late August, staggering from Luke's arms to Grace's with a look of fierce concentration that made them both hold their breath. When she made it across the gap, Grace swept her up and spun her around while Luke cheered. That's our girl, he said proudly. Strong and determined, just like her mama. As autumn approached again, bringing with it the anniversary of Faith's birth and Grace's arrival on the mountain, Grace found herself reflecting on how much had changed in 2 years. She'd gone from being a woman sold as worthless to a wife, mother, and the catalyst for medical justice. She'd gone from believing herself broken to understanding that she'd never been the problem at all. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Faith played at their feet, Grace leaned against Luke's shoulder and said, Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my father hadn't sold me? If I'd stayed in Evergreen Hollow? Luke was quiet for a moment, considering. I think you would have survived, he said finally, because that's who you are, a survivor. But I don't think you would have thrived, not the way you've thrived here. And you? Grace asked. What would have happened to you? I'd have stayed in my grief, Luke said honestly. I'd have gone through the motions of living without ever really being alive. You saved me, Grace. You brought me back from a very dark place. Grace laced her fingers through his. We saved each other, she said. That's what love does. It takes two broken people and makes them whole. Faith chose that moment to toddle over and grab onto Grace's skirt, demanding to be picked up. Grace obliged, settling their daughter on her lap while Luke's arm came around both of them. They sat there as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Three people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built a family out of love and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to accept anyone else's definition of their worth. In October, Grace received another letter from Thomas. Dr. Winter's license had been officially revoked by the state medical board. He'd been publicly censured, his reputation destroyed, his practice shut down. Several women had come forward with their own stories of his malpractice, adding their voices to Grace's. And Edmund Whitmore had broken his engagement to the woman his mother had chosen for him, announcing that he planned to move to California and start fresh somewhere his family's reputation couldn't follow him. The town of Evergreen Hollow was changing, Thomas wrote. People were questioning things they'd never questioned before, challenging authorities they'd never challenged, and it had all started with Grace's refusal to accept the lies they'd told about her. You changed things, Luke said after reading the letter. Not just for yourself, but for everyone. Grace thought about Sarah Miller and all the other women who'd looked at her with such hope that day in the town square. Thought about the women who might now get second opinions instead of accepting a charlatan's diagnosis. Thought about the ripples spreading out from one act of defiance. I just refused to be silent, she said. I refused to accept that I was worthless just because someone said so. Anyone could have done the same thing. But they didn't, Luke pointed out. You did. That's what makes you remarkable. 2 years turned into 3, then 4. Faith grew into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and showed no fear of the wilderness around her. She helped Luke with the animals, helped Grace in the garden they'd expanded, and showed a stubborn independence that made them both laugh and occasionally tear their hair out. They had another child, a son they named Samuel, after Grace's father, because Grace said she wanted to reclaim the name and give it to someone who would honor it properly. And then another daughter, Anna, named for Luke's first wife, because some loves deserve to be remembered even as new loves bloomed. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family. Luke built an addition, then another. The ranch prospered as Luke's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were happy. Grace taught all 3 of her children to read using the volume of poetry Luke had saved from his first marriage. She told them stories about resilience and courage, about refusing to accept other people's limitations, about building the life you wanted instead of accepting the life you were given. And when Faith was 10 years old and came home crying because a boy in the Valley School had called her mother a name, had said Grace had been sold like property because she was worthless, Grace sat her daughter down and told her the whole story. The diagnosis, the betrayal, the sale, the journey through snow, the love that had saved them both. "You need to understand something, Faith," Grace said, holding her daughter's hands. "People will always try to define you by their own narrow understanding of worth. They'll try to put you in boxes, limit what you can do, tell you what you're capable of. And you need to look them in the eye and refuse. Refuse their limits. Refuse their definitions. Refuse to be anything less than exactly who you are." "Like you did?" Faith asked. "Like I did," Grace confirmed. "Like your father did. Like everyone who's ever decided their life was their own to build." Faith wiped her tears and nodded. "Then that's what I'll do too." And she did. All 3 of their children grew up strong and confident, secure in the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally, that their worth was inherent and not dependent on anyone else's approval. They grew up wild and free on that mountain, learning from parents who'd survived the worst and built something beautiful out of the ashes. Years passed, and Grace's hair turned gray at the temples, and Luke's beard went white. They grew old together on that mountain, watching their children grow and eventually leave to build their own lives. Faith became a teacher, determined to ensure no child ever felt worthless the way her mother had. Samuel took over the ranch, expanding it into something even larger than Luke had built. Anna became a doctor, inspired by her mother's stories of Dr. Harrison's kindness and determined to help women who faced medical prejudice. And through it all, Grace and Luke remained devoted to each other, the love that had started in darkness and desperation, maturing into something deep and unshakable. On their 20th anniversary, Luke gave Grace a leather-bound journal filled with all the letters she'd received over the years from women thanking her for giving them courage to question their own diagnoses, to seek second opinions, to refuse to accept that they were broken. "You changed so many lives," Luke said as Grace paged through the journal with tears streaming down her face. "You saved so many women from the fate you suffered. And it all started with your refusal to be silent." "It started with you," Grace corrected, "with you seeing me as worthy when no one else did, with you giving me a place to heal and grow, with you loving me when I didn't think I deserved to be loved." Luke pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in the cabin where their love story had begun, holding each other the way they'd held each other through 2 decades of joy and struggle and ordinary miracles. "We saved each other," Luke said, echoing Grace's words from so many years ago. "That's what love does." Grace thought about the girl she'd been, the one trudging through snow with bound wrists, believing herself worthless and broken. That girl would never have imagined this life, would never have believed that being sold for $50 would lead to 20 years of love and 3 beautiful children and a legacy of courage that touched dozens of lives. But that was the thing about life, Grace had learned. It rarely went the way you planned. Sometimes it went somewhere better, somewhere you'd never have had the courage to dream. She'd been called barren, worthless, cursed. She'd been sold like property and abandoned by her own family. She'd been told she had no value, no purpose, no future worth having. And she'd proven every single one of them wrong. Not by becoming what they wanted her to be, but by refusing to accept their definition of who she was. by building a life on her own terms with a man who saw her worth, by raising children who knew their value was inherent and unchangeable, by standing up to cruelty and creating space for other women to stand up too. As Grace stood in Luke's arms, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become her home, she thought about all the women who'd written to her over the years, all the lives that had been changed by her refusal to be silent, all the ripples spreading out from one act of defiance. Her family had sold her as worthless, but a rancher had seen her worth, had gotten her pregnant in days when everyone said it was impossible, had loved her truly and completely for 20 years and counting. And that love, that impossible, miraculous, defiant love, had changed everything. Grace smiled and held Luke tighter, grateful for every step of the journey that had brought her here. The pain had been real, and the betrayal had cut deep. But the love had been deeper. The healing had been real, and the life they'd built together had been worth every moment of struggle. This was her story. Not the one others had written for her, but the one she'd written herself. A story of survival and defiance and love that refused to die even in the darkest winter. And it was beautiful. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace and Luke turned back toward their cabin, the home they'd built together, filled with memories and love and proof that sometimes the most impossible miracles are the ones that start with someone simply refusing to give up. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but the people who lived among them had changed everything, had proven that worth wasn't something bestowed by others, but something inherent and unshakable, had shown that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, had demonstrated that sometimes being sold as worthless was just the beginning of discovering your true value. And on certain mornings, when the mist lifted and the world felt new and full of possibility, you could still hear their laughter carried on the wind, a reminder that the most impossible miracles are the ones we choose to believe in, the ones we fight for, the ones we build with our own stubborn, beautiful hands. This was their story, and it would echo through generations, inspiring anyone who'd ever been told they weren't enough to stand up and prove the world wrong. Because Grace Carver had done exactly that, and in doing so, she'd given permission to everyone who came after her to do the same.